She stepped off the train into a town that smelled of dust and broken promises. The man who had paid for her journey was already in the ground. She had $4, no family, and 3,000 miles of nothing behind her, but the three brothers waiting at the station did not know it yet. The woman they had just offered a job to was about to uncover a murder, face down a killer, and burn their quiet world to the ground in the best possible way. This is her story. The land did not care that she was coming. It had no interest in her grief, her fear, or the bundle of letters she clutched against her chest like a talisman against the unknown. The Colorado Territory stretched out beneath a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon whole, and the wind that swept across the plains carried nothing but dust and the dry scent of sage, and the absolute indifference of a world that existed long before human beings gave it a name, and would exist long after the last one was gone. Against this immensity, a train crawled westward like an iron caterpillar, trailing black smoke across the golden emptiness. Inside a second-class car that smelled of coal dust and unwashed wool and the sour residue of too many bodies confined in too small a space for too many days, Clara Whitmore sat by the window and watched America unfold. She was 22 years old. She weighed barely 110 pounds. She owned one carpet bag, two practical dresses, a cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother, a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets that had belonged to her father, and exactly $4.37. She also owned a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon, written by a man she had never met, a man she had agreed to marry, a man who at this very moment was waiting for her in a town called Silverton, at the edge of the known world. Or so she believed. The train was 12 hours late. A bridge washout in Kansas had stranded them on a siding for half a day while repair crews worked in the rain, and Clara had spent those hours doing what she had done for the past 3,000 miles. She sat, she watched. She held the letters and tried to imagine the face of the man who had written them. Thomas Caldwell, cattle rancher, Silverton, Colorado Territory. She whispered the name, sometimes testing how it felt in her mouth, trying to make it real. Mrs. Thomas Caldwell. Clara Caldwell. The words had no weight yet. They were sounds without substance, a future she could not quite touch. But it was the only future she had left. She thought about Philadelphia. She could not help it. The memories came unbidden, rising like smoke from embers she had tried to bury. The narrow row house on Elm Street where she had grown up. The smell of lavender and old books that permeated every room. The sound of her father reading Dickens aloud on winter evenings while rain pattered against the windows and the fire crackled low. Her mother's gentle hands guiding hers over needlework, patient and warm, teaching her the small domestic arts that were supposed to prepare a young woman for the life she was expected to live. They had not been wealthy. Her father taught literature at a small academy and earned what small academy teachers earn, which was never quite enough. Her mother took in sewing to supplement her nimble fingers, producing work so fine that women from better neighborhoods sought her out. But what the Whitmore household lacked in money, it possessed in abundance of a different currency. Books lined every wall. Conversation flowed freely at the dinner table. Ideas were welcomed, questions encouraged, and Clara grew up believing that knowledge was the truest form of wealth. Then the scarlet fever came. It swept through their neighborhood in the autumn of 1874. Like a biblical plague, indiscriminate and merciless. Her father was the first to fall. A robust man who had never been sick a day in Clara's memory, reduced in a single week to a shadow beneath sweat-soaked sheets, his voice that had brought Shakespeare and Dickens to life, fading to a whisper, then to silence. He died on a Tuesday morning. Clara held his hand. Her mother prayed in the next room. The clock on the mantel ticked on as if nothing in the world had changed. Her mother followed 12 days later. Clara believed and would always believe that her mother had willed herself to live just long enough to see her daughter's 22nd birthday. The morning after that milestone, as if she had been holding a door open for Clara to step through into adulthood, she closed her eyes and did not open them again. Clara buried her parents in the same week in adjacent plots, in a cemetery she could not afford. The funeral expenses consumed the small savings account. The landlord, a man named Grisham, who delivered his condolences with the practiced sympathy of someone who had evicted dozens of grieving families, gave her 30 days to vacate. The teaching position at the charity school, which had been her purpose and her joy, paid barely enough for food, let alone rent in even the cheapest boarding house. For 3 months she survived. That was the only word for it. She moved from one boarding house to another, each cheaper and more wretched than the last. The wallpaper peeled, the floors sagged. The other tenants had eyes that told stories Clara did not want to read. She ate sparingly and saved desperately, and watched her small reserve of money dwindle like sand through an hourglass that nobody could turn over. She saw what happened to women who ran out of options. They were impossible to miss in Philadelphia, those women. Hollow-eyed and coughing outside the textile factories, aging decades in a single year of 14-hour shifts. Standing on corners in the gaslight district after dark, their painted faces masks of calculated desperation. Clara understood with crystalline clarity that the distance between herself and those women was measured not in moral fiber or strength of character, but in dollars and weeks. She had perhaps 2 months before she joined them. It was Mrs. Keegan, the widow who ran the boarding house on Chestnut Street, who changed the trajectory of Clara Whitmore's life. Mrs. Keegan kept a stack of newspapers for her tenants, and among them, one gray February morning, Clara found a copy of the Matrimonial News. She read through the advertisements with a mixture of curiosity and something close to revulsion. Men describing themselves like livestock at auction. Women required to provide testimonials of character as if applying for employment at a bank. The entire enterprise felt transactional and faintly desperate, and Clara understood with sudden and uncomfortable honesty that transactional and desperate described her situation exactly. One advertisement stopped her, not because of flowery promises or grandiose claims, but because of its plainness, because it sounded like a real person talking rather than a salesman performing. Cattle rancher in Colorado Territory seeks bride of good moral character, sound health, and willing spirit. Must not be afraid of hard work or wide spaces. Offer genuine partnership to right woman. No drunkards, gamblers, or men of idle disposition need respond. Wait, that is for me to worry about. If you are reading this, know that I am a plain man with a good ranch and a lonely supper table. T. Caldwell, Silverton, Colorado. The humor in that last section. The accidental humanity of a man who forgot he was writing an advertisement and started talking like a person. It made Clara smile for the first time in weeks. She wrote to Thomas Caldwell that same evening, her pen moving with the desperate fluency of a woman who had just been thrown a rope in deep water. Their correspondence lasted 3 months, 27 letters in total, 13 from her and 14 from him, each one revealing a little more of the person behind the words. Thomas wrote about his ranch with the unself-conscious love of a man who had built something from nothing and understood its value down to the last fence post. He described the mountains at sunset, the way the light turned the peaks to hammered copper and the valleys to pools of purple shadow. He wrote about the sound of cattle in the morning, hundreds of hooves on hard earth, a sound like distant thunder that never quite arrived. He described the creek that crossed his property, how it froze in winter into what he called crystal sculptures that caught the light in ways that would make an artist weep. He wrote about his plans, expanding the herd, building a proper house to replace the cabin he currently occupied, planting fruit trees that would not bear for 5 years because he believed in investing in the future. He was a man who thought in seasons and decades, not days and weeks, and Clara found that quality deeply reassuring in a world that had taught her how quickly everything could be taken away. He never wrote about love. Neither did Clara. Their arrangement was what it was, and both of them were honest about that. Clara appreciated his candor. Thomas in turn wrote that he valued her uncommon directness and her refusal to pretend this is something it isn't. They were two practical people making a practical choice, and there was dignity in that honesty that Clara found more comforting than any amount of romantic language would have been. But in his last letter, Thomas had written a single line that planted a small, stubborn seed of hope in Clara's heart. I believe two people of good character can build affection from shared purpose, and I look forward to building with you. And below it, almost as an afterthought, that Clara suspected was not an afterthought at all. I should mention that I keep a decent library for a cattleman, and I make a tolerable beef stew. There was something else in that letter, something Clara did not fully understand at the time, but which lodged in her memory like a splinter. Thomas had written almost casually that there are men in this territory who would take what is not theirs by any means necessary, and that he had taken precautions. She filed the words away without knowing their significance. They would come to mean everything. Clara accepted his proposal and the train ticket he sent. She packed her mother's cameo, her father's Shakespeare, two practical dresses, and every scrap of courage she possessed into a battered carpet bag. On a gray Philadelphia morning in July of 1875, she boarded the westbound train and watched the only world she had ever known disappear behind her like a closing chapter in a book she could never reopen. Now, 6 days later, the train pulled into Silverton Station with a shriek of brakes and a great exhalation of steam, and Clara Whitmore stepped down into the Colorado wind. Silverton was not what the word town had prepared her for. The station was a wooden platform with a hand-painted sign already fading in the relentless sun. Beyond it stretched a single main street of packed dirt lined on both sides with buildings in varying states of completion. Some were proper storefronts with glass windows and painted facades, ambitious declarations of civilization. Others were rough wooden structures that looked like they might blow over in a strong wind, held together by nails and optimism, and not much else. Everything was coated in dust. The buildings, the horses tied to hitching posts, the dogs sleeping in patches of shade, the people moving along the boardwalks. Even the sky seemed dusty, the blue hazed with a golden particulate that turned the sunlight thick and warm and slightly unreal. Women in calico dresses hurried past women in gaudy face paint who lingered on second-floor balconies above the saloons. Cowboys on horseback moved through the street with the easy authority of men who belonged here. Miners with pickaxes slung over their shoulders trudged toward the hills. A barber swept the porch of his shop, pausing to watch Clara with open curiosity. Silverton was the American frontier in miniature. Half aspiration, half desperation, entirely unfinished. Clara approached the station master, a weathered old man named Ezra Potts, whose gray mustache drooped at the corners like a willow tree mourning the loss of its youth. His spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose, and he had the permanently distracted air of a man who had seen too many arrivals and departures to invest much emotion in either. "Excuse me," Clara said. "I am looking for Mr. Thomas Caldwell. I was meant to arrive yesterday." The change in Ezra Potts was immediate and unmistakable. The distracted air vanished. His hands stilled on the telegram he had been sorting. He removed his spectacles, slowly cleaning them with a handkerchief, in the deliberate way of a man buying time before delivering news he wished he did not have. "Miss," he said, and there was a gentleness in the word that terrified her. "I am afraid I have some unfortunate news. Mr. Caldwell was killed 3 days ago. Shot dead at the Golden Spur Saloon. There was a dispute over water rights, they say." He paused. "I am mighty sorry." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The sensation was physical. A cold tide receding from her extremities, leaving her fingertips numb and her vision narrowing to a point. She heard the words. She understood the words. But her mind refused to assemble them into meaning the way a person might stare at the pieces of a shattered plate and not quite accept that it will never hold water again. "But she started. The words came out as a whisper. "I am to be his wife." "I know, miss. The whole town knew he was expecting a bride." Ezra shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Terrible business. Town is still talking about it. If you need passage back east, there is a train tomorrow morning." Clara sank onto the wooden bench beside the platform. Her carpet bag fell from nerveless fingers. 3,000 miles from home. No family to return to. No future husband. The last of her savings spent on necessities for the journey. The letters in her lap, tied with blue ribbon, suddenly felt like artifacts from a civilization that no longer existed. She sat there for what might have been 5 minutes or 50, watching the life of Silverton continue around her, as if nothing had happened, as if the world had not just collapsed into a hole the exact size and shape of her last hope. And then she felt it, the prickling awareness on the back of her neck that meant someone was watching her. Clara looked up. Across the street, leaning against a post outside the saloon, with the ease of a man who made a profession of leaning against things, stood a figure in a long black duster coat. He was watching her with eyes that held no warmth, no curiosity, no sympathy. They were flat and appraising the eyes of a man calculating the value of something. He noted her arrival. He noted her conversation with the station master. He noted her distress. Then, as casually as a cat losing interest in a bird it has decided not to chase, He pushed himself off the post and disappeared through the saloon doors. Clara did not know his name. She did not know that the man in the black coat was named Jeb Holloway, that he was a former cavalry scout turned hired gun, that he worked for a man named Victor Crane, and that 3 days ago he had deliberately provoked Thomas Caldwell into a fight that ended with a bullet in Thomas Caldwell's chest. She did not know any of that yet, but the cold feeling his gaze left on her skin would stay with her, and in the weeks to come she would learn to recognize it for what it was: the feeling of being watched by something dangerous. A voice cut through her spiral of despair, steady, male, carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to large spaces and hard decisions. "You all right there, miss?" Clara looked up and saw two men standing before her, and even through the fog of her shock, she registered the difference between them, the way people instinctively register the difference between a mountain and the foothills beside it. The first man was tall, not merely tall in the way city men were tall, but tall in the way that the landscape itself was large, as if the territory had grown him to scale. Broad-shouldered with hands that looked capable of breaking things or building them with equal competence. His hair was chestnut brown streaked with gold, where the sun had claimed it, and his eyes beneath the brim of a well-worn hat were the color of whiskey held up to firelight. Amber and warm and sharp all at once. His face was cleanly shaved, the jaw strong and set with a hardness that spoke of years of making difficult decisions and living with the consequences. There were small scars on his hands, the accumulated evidence of a life spent working with rope and wood and iron and the unpredictable horns of cattle. He carried himself with the contained stillness of a man who knew his own strength and was careful with it. Beside him stood a second man, slightly shorter, but still imposing, with dark blonde hair that fell in careless waves and amber eyes a shade warmer than his companions. Where the first man's face was carved from granite, this one seemed shaped from something more forgiving. His mouth held the ghost of a smile even in this serious moment, as if humor was his natural resting state and gravity required conscious effort. "Name is Wyatt Hawthorne," the first man said, removing his hat in a gesture of courtesy that belonged to a gentler era. "This here is my brother Garrett. We could not help but overhear. You are Thomas Caldwell's—" "His bride," Clara finished, and the words snagged in her throat like a fishhook. "His mail-order bride. A day late, it seems." "2 days would not have made a difference," Miss Garrett said, and beneath his easy manner his voice was surprisingly gentle. "Thomas was killed the day before you were supposed to arrive. You knew him." "He was a neighbor," Wyatt said carefully. "Our ranch borders his land to the west. We did business together, bought and sold cattle at the same markets." He paused. "He was a decent man. What happened to him was not right." There was something in the way he said those last 4 words, an emphasis that went beyond the ordinary sadness of a neighbor lost to violence, a tightness in his jaw that had suggested he meant more than the simple tragedy of a man shot in a saloon dispute. Clara noticed it even through the thickness of her shock and filed it away alongside Thomas's cryptic warning about men who took what was not theirs. While Wyatt spoke, Clara noticed that Garrett's eyes kept drifting across the street toward the Golden Spur Saloon. Each time he glanced that way, the easy smile faltered. Something darker moved behind his eyes, something haunted and heavy. He shifted his weight, touched the back of his neck, unconscious gestures of a man carrying a burden he had not put down. Clara, overwhelmed as she was, did not have the capacity to analyze his behavior. But Garrett Hawthorne was carrying a secret, and it was eating him from the inside. Wyatt offered Clara a lifeline in the form of practical kindness. His sister, he explained, ran the boarding house just down the street. Margaret Wells recently widowed a good woman with fair prices and a fierce devotion to propriety. Clara would be safe there while she figured out what came next. "I have not got much to figure," Clara said quietly. "I have $4, no family east or west, and no prospects in either direction." Something moved behind Wyatt Hawthorne's amber eyes. Not pity, Clara noted. She was grateful for that. Pity would have broken her. What she saw instead was recognition. The look of a man who understood what it meant to stand at the edge of everything you knew and stare down into nothing. "One thing at a time, Miss Whitmore. Clara Whitmore. Miss Whitmore, let us get you somewhere safe and warm, and then we can talk about what comes next." On the walk to the boarding house, they passed the land office. Garrett nodded toward a man emerging from the building, and Clara saw Wyatt's posture change, a subtle stiffening the way a horse shifts when it scents something dangerous on the wind. The man was tall and silver-haired, wearing a charcoal suit that looked as out of place in Silverton as a silk glove on a blacksmith. He carried himself with the polished assurance of wealth and influence, and when he saw the Hawthorns, he tipped his hat with a courtesy so exaggerated it circled all the way back around to insult. His smile did not reach his eyes. His eyes were gray and cold and calculating, and Clara felt them pass over her with the same flat appraisal she had felt from the man in the black duster. "Who is that?" she asked. "Victor Crane," Garrett said, and the name came out like something that tasted sour. "Land speculator from Denver. Been buying up property around here for the past year. Generous offers at first, then less generous." "Garrett," Wyatt said, a single word loaded with caution. Garrett fell silent, but his jaw tightened, and his eyes followed Crane's black carriage as it rolled down the street. And Clara understood without being told that the story of Silverton was more complicated than a simple frontier town struggling to grow. Margaret Hawthorne Wells was a revelation. She stood in the doorway of her boarding house like a general surveying a battlefield, and Clara understood immediately that this was a woman who had taken the raw material of grief and forged it into competence. She was 30 years old with the same blue-touched eyes as her brothers, her late husband's wedding ring hanging on a chain around her neck, her sleeves permanently rolled to the elbow. She took one look at Clara's ashen face, listened to the situation in 3 sentences, and shifted into action with the efficiency of someone who had no patience for the luxury of standing still. A room at reduced rate, a basin of warm water, hot food, strong tea, clean towels. "You will stay as long as you need to sort things out," Maggie said, showing Clara to a small but spotless bedroom on the 2nd floor. "And do not you worry about vultures in this town trying to take advantage. Any friend of my brother's is under my protection." That evening at the communal dining table, Clara began to understand the world she had entered. The boarders assembled for supper like a cross-section of frontier society. Miss Agnes Perry, the school teacher, a thin woman of indeterminate middle age who was leaving Silverton at month's end, her contract expired, her patience with frontier life exhausted. A mercantile clerk named Osgood, who gossiped about Caldwell's death with inappropriate relish between bites of cornbread, and Mrs. Doris Finch, an elderly widow who knitted continuously while she ate her needles, clicking in a rhythm as steady and unstoppable as a heartbeat. It was Mrs. Finch who dropped the observation that lodged in Clara's mind like a stone dropped into still water. She said it mildly between stitches, her eyes on her work, and her voice carrying no more weight than if she had been commenting on the weather. "Third rancher this year to meet trouble after refusing to sell to that Crane fellow. Just bad luck, I suppose." The needles clicked, the clock ticked. Nobody at the table responded, but Clara noticed that Miss Perry pressed her lips together, and Osgood suddenly found his cornbread fascinating. "Third rancher, after refusing to sell. Just bad luck." Clara stored the words alongside Thomas's warning, and the cold eyes of the man in the black coat, in the way Garrett looked at the golden spur, and the emphasis in Wyatt's voice when he said what happened to Thomas was not right. She did not yet have enough pieces to assemble the picture, but she was beginning to sense its shape, and the shape was ugly. After dinner, Wyatt returned to the boarding house. He had cleaned up from his day, changed his shirt, combed his hair. In the lamplight of the parlor, Clara got her first unhurried look at him, and what she saw both reassured and unsettled her. The scars on his hands told the story of years of hard labor. Rope burns healed nicks from barbed wire, the thickened calluses of a man who gripped tools and reins from dawn to dark. He held his coffee cup with a care that seemed almost delicate in hands, so large, as if even in this small act he was conscious of his own strength and determined not to break what he held. There was fatigue around his eyes, not the tiredness of a single long day, but the deep accumulation of years of carrying more weight than one pair of shoulders was designed to bear. Wyatt Hawthorne. Clara understood was a man who had been responsible for other people for a very long time, and who had paid for that responsibility in sleep and ease and whatever lightness his younger self might once have possessed. "May I ask you something about Mr. Caldwell?" Clara said when the other boarders had dispersed. "I realize I knew very little about the man I agreed to marry. Our letters were formal. He told me about his ranch, his plans, his daily life, but I never learned who he truly was." Wyatt considered her question, turning his coffee cup slowly between his palms. He was determined, Built his ranch from nothing in 5 years, which is something most men cannot do in 10. Not always the easiest man to deal with, but fair in business. Honest. He paused. He deserved better than what he got. And what were your plans with him, Miss Whitmore, if you do not mind my asking? To be a good wife, she answered simply. To keep his home, bear his children, build a life together. I taught at a charity school before my parents died, but mostly I wanted security and perhaps in time genuine affection. She looked down at her hands folded in her lap. Now I have until tomorrow morning to decide whether to spend my last dollars on a ticket back to Philadelphia, where I have nothing and no one. Wyatt held her gaze for a long moment. Then he excused himself and stepped outside into the night. He found his brothers waiting in the shadows beside the livery stable. Garrett leaned against the fence rail, arms crossed. And beside him, revealed in the lamplight, spilling from the stable door, stood the third Hawthorne brother. Silas Hawthorne was 26 years old, and he was different from his brothers in ways that were immediately apparent. Where Wyatt communicated authority and Garrett communicated charm, Silas communicated a quiet intensity that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with attention. He was leaning against the stable wall, whittling a piece of wood with the focused ease of someone whose hands were never idle, his auburn red hair catching the light in copper streaks. When Wyatt approached, Silas looked up, and his green amber eyes held the sharp awareness of a man who noticed everything and said very little. "The mail order bride?" Silas asked simply. Wyatt nodded. "What is she like?" "Educated, capable, terrified but hiding it well." Silas absorbed this with a slight nod and returned his attention to the wood in his hands. The three brothers talked in the shorthand of men who had shared a life so long that half their communication happened in the spaces between words. Wyatt proposed offering Clara employment at the ranch. Their mother had passed 8 months ago, and the house had suffered accordingly. The account books were a disaster. The kitchen was a health hazard. None of them could cook a meal that did not end in smoke or regret. Garrett was immediately supportive. "She is educated, she is capable, and she has got nowhere to go. It is the right thing, Wyatt." Silas raised the one objection that mattered. "A woman alone on a ranch with 3 unmarried men. People will talk." "Let them talk," Wyatt said, and there was iron in his voice. "Maggie will vouch for our character, and Miss Whitmore will have her own room with a lock on the door. It will be proper." The decision was made. Wyatt returned to Clara and presented the proposition. Employment as housekeeper and bookkeeper at Hawks Ridge Room and board included. He explained the situation plainly without embellishment. 3 brothers in the house, a sister who visited regularly. Work that was hard but honest. A room of her own, private and secure. "If it does not suit you, after 1 month I will pay your passage back east myself," he said. "But I want you to understand something, Miss Whitmore. There are 3 of us brothers in that house, and our sister visits regularly. Your reputation will be protected. My word on that." Clara studied his face. The granite exterior, the amber eyes that held more warmth than his expression admitted. The absolute steadiness of his gaze, the look of a man who made promises rarely and kept them always. She thought about Philadelphia, the boarding houses, the factories, the gaslight district. She thought about the alternative, which was this man, this ranch, this territory. She did not understand this leap into the unknown that required every ounce of the courage her parents had spent 22 years building into her. "I accept your offer, Mr. Hawthorne, and I want you to know that I am not a fragile woman. Whatever work needs doing, I will do it." Something shifted in Wyatt's expression. A crack in the granite. Not quite a smile, but the possibility of one, and a flicker of something that looked like respect. "No, Miss Whitmore, I do not believe you are fragile at all." That night, Clara lay in the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling and weighed her decision from every angle. She thought about the 3 brothers, Wyatt's stoic authority, Garrett's disarming charm, and the shadow that crossed his face when he looked at the saloon. Silas's quiet watchfulness, the way his hands were always creating something, the sharp intelligence in his green amber eyes. She was nearly asleep when voices floated up through her open window from the alley below. Clara rose and peered out into the darkness. Below, barely visible in the moonlight, Garrett Hawthorne stood pressed against the wall of the boarding house, speaking in urgent, hushed tones with a second figure. The other man was lean and wore spectacles that caught a glint of moonlight. And though Clara could not see his face clearly, there was something familiar about his posture, the careful bearing of a professional man. His voice, when fragments reached her, carried the measured cadence of someone accustomed to delivering difficult truths. Garrett's body language was tense, almost desperate, entirely different from the easygoing man who had smiled his way through the afternoon. She heard fragments. Garrett's voice strained with something that sounded very much like guilt. Cannot keep quiet forever. And then lower but no less intense. He did not deserve what happened to him. Before she could hear more, Garrett glanced upward. Clara pulled back from the window, heart hammering. She pressed herself against the wall and held her breath until she heard footsteps retreating down the alley and into silence. She did not sleep for a long time after that. What did Garrett Hawthorne know about the death of Thomas Caldwell? And who was the man he had been confiding in under the cover of darkness? 3 days later, Clara found herself sitting beside Wyatt on a wagon loaded with flour and salt and coffee and fencing wire bouncing along a rutted trail that led away from Silverton and into the open country. Garrett rode alongside on a bay gelding, his hat pushed back, keeping up a running narration of the landscape that was part history lesson and part tall tale. Silas drove a second wagon behind them, loaded with lumber and tools, silent as the mountains that watched their passage. The Colorado Territory revealed itself to Clara in layers of grandeur she had no frame of reference to absorb. Vast stretches of prairie grass rippled in the wind like a golden ocean, each gust sending waves across the surface that rolled toward the horizon and disappeared. The Rocky Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already white with early snow despite the summer warmth below, and the contrast between the gentle gold of the prairie and the brutal blue of the mountains was so stark it seemed like two different paintings hung side by side. The sky. Clara could not get over the sky. In Philadelphia, the sky was a strip of gray between rooftops. Here it was everything. It stretched from horizon to horizon in an unbroken dome of blue so deep it seemed almost purple at the zenith, and the clouds that moved across it cast shadows on the prairie below that were the size of entire city blocks. "There it is," Wyatt said, and his voice carried a note Clara had not heard from him before. Pride. Not the boastful pride of a man showing off possessions, but the deep, quiet pride of a man who had built something with his hands and his will, and 13 years of dawn to dark labor, and knew its worth down to the last fence post. Hawks Ridge. The ranch spread before them against a gentle rise, and Clara took it in piece by piece, understanding that she was looking at the place that would either become her salvation or her next dead end. The main house was larger than she had expected, a 2-story structure of hewn logs and white clapboard with a wide covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. It had the solid, settled look of a building constructed not for show, but for endurance, designed to withstand whatever the Colorado winters could throw at it. But 8 months of neglect were evident everywhere. Shutters hung at careless angles. Garden beds that had once been tended were now overrun with weeds. A rocking chair on the porch had a broken spindle, and the whole place carried the slightly forlorn air of a home that had lost the person who made it a home. Beyond the house stood a large barn, its doors painted red, though the paint was peeling, a bunkhouse for hired hands and several outbuildings. A smokehouse, a chicken coop inhabited by 2 hens of supreme indifference, a storage shed with a door that did not quite close, and surrounding it all, stretching to the horizon in every direction, pasture land dotted with cattle that moved in slow, purposeful groups across the grass. "You have hired men?" Clara asked, noting the bunkhouse. 2 year-round, Wyatt answered. "Old Emmett Dawson and his son Nolan. They have been with us since I was 19. Good men. Take their meals in the bunkhouse, keep to themselves. The main house is private." He paused. "Your room will be at the back of the house on the ground floor." It was our mother's room. He said this last part with careful neutrality, but Clara caught the slight tightening of his grip on the reins. 8 months since their mother died. The wound was still open. Inside the house, the evidence of 3 men living alone without domestic guidance was immediate and comprehensive. The bones of the place were good. Clara could see quality in the furniture, solid and well-proportioned, and she would later learn it was all Silas's work. The curtains were hand-sewn with care that spoke of their mother's patient hands, now dusty with months of neglect. The stone fireplace that dominated the main room was handsome and well-built. The kitchen had decent equipment, A good iron stove, proper pots, sharp knives. But the surfaces were buried under dust. The kitchen was a catastrophe of unwashed dishes, disorganized supplies, and one pot that appeared to have been welded shut by whatever had been burned inside it. The account ledgers stacked on a desk in the corner looked like they had been filled in by a man who considered bookkeeping a particularly cruel form of punishment. Clara conducted her assessment with the practical eye of a woman who had managed a household since she was 16. She opened cupboards, checked the pantry, examined the stove, ran a finger along shelves, and studied what came away on the tip. The three brothers watched her with varying degrees of apprehension. Wyatt stood rigid near the door. Garrett leaned against the wall with his arms crossed in a look of guilty amusement. Silas sat on the stairs, a half-carved wooden horse in his hands, his expression unreadable. "It is not as bad as I feared," Clara said diplomatically. All three brothers visibly relaxed. "Though I suspect your mother would have strong words about the state of this kitchen." Garrett's laugh broke the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. "She would have begun a switch to all three of us, and we would have deserved it." Clara was shown to her room, simply furnished, but with a window that caught the afternoon light and a hand-stitched quilt on the bed that carried the faintest scent of lavender. A small vase on the nightstand held dried wildflowers that someone had placed recently. Clara would later suspect Silas, though she could never be certain, and he would never admit it. "You need anything, my room is upstairs at the end of the hall," Wyatt said from the doorway. "Garrett is across from me, Silas, at the top of the stairs. Meals have been irregular, to say the least. If you could establish some kind of routine, we would all benefit." "I will begin tomorrow," Clara said. "And Mr. Hawthorne, I will need access to the account books as well. If I am to manage a household properly, I need to understand the finances." Something that might have been admiration moved across Wyatt's face. "They are on the desk, fair warning. I am not much of a bookkeeper." "So I noticed," Clara said, and was rewarded with the first genuine half-smile she had seen from Wyatt Hawthorne. It transformed his face the way sunlight transforms a winter landscape, revealing warmth and depth that the habitual severity had hidden, and Clara felt something unexpected stir in her chest. A warmth she immediately and firmly identified as gratitude and nothing more. The first week tested Clara's strength and proved her worth. She rose before dawn each morning, before even Wyatt was awake, and threw herself into the work of reclaiming the neglected house. Room by room, surface by surface. She scrubbed floors on her hands and knees until the wood grain emerged from beneath layers of grime like a painting restored. She reorganized the kitchen into a system of labeled jars and logical shelves so that any of the brothers could find flour or salt or coffee without launching an expedition. She beat dust from curtains and rugs until her arms ached and the air outside was thick with the gray ghosts of months of neglect. She tackled the account books and discovered that Wyatt's bookkeeping, while chaotic in form, revealed a fundamentally sound operation. The numbers were all there, just scattered across pages like seeds thrown by a careless hand. Clara gathered them, organized them, and within 3 days had produced a ledger so clean and logical that Wyatt stared at it for a full minute without speaking. Each brother responded to Clara's presence differently, and in those differences she began to understand the men she was living with. Wyatt was formal and distant, scrupulously polite. He left before dawn and returned after dark, took his meals with a "Thank you, Miss Whitmore," that never varied and gave her space that sometimes felt less like respect and more like avoidance. But Clara noticed things. The firewood box beside the kitchen stove, which she emptied quickly with all her cooking, was always full by morning. She never once saw Wyatt fill it. The path from the house to the outhouse was graveled smooth one night after she mentioned the mud. A lantern appeared on the porch railing the evening after she had stumbled on the dark steps. Small acts, wordless, consistent. Garrett was warmth itself. He found reasons to linger in the kitchen while Clara cooked, stealing biscuits from the cooling rack and absorbing her mock stern reprimands with theatrical repentance that made her laugh, despite herself. He was easy to talk to, easy to be around, the kind of man who could make a stranger feel like an old friend within 5 minutes. Through Garrett, Clara learned the family history: a father who was harsh and spare with affection, a mother who was gentle and generous with it. The fierce bond between the three brothers forged not in comfort, but in shared hardship. But even as Garrett charmed and entertained, Clara could not forget the conversation she had overheard in the alley behind the boarding house. The strained voice. The guilt, the word she could not unhear. He did not deserve what happened to him. Garrett Hawthorne was a man of easy surfaces and hidden depths, and Clara was beginning to suspect that what lay beneath the surface was something dangerous. Silas communicated almost entirely through action. He did not linger in the kitchen or tell stories by the fire. Instead, things appeared. A carved wooden spoon handle beautiful in its simplicity to replace the cracked one Clara had been making do with. A shelf installed in the pantry at precisely the height she had mentioned would be convenient. A sketch of a meadowlark left on the dining table one morning after Clara had said in passing that she missed the sound of birds from her Philadelphia garden. Each gift was anonymous and unacknowledged, and each one told Clara more about Silas Hawthorne than 100 conversations could have. At the end of the first week, Clara returned from a supply run to Silverton with Maggie and found a piece of paper nailed to the ranch gate. Block letters crude and deliberate. 5 words. Mind your own cattle. Wyatt tore it down without expression, his jaw set to stone. He told Clara it was nothing, probably a disgruntled neighbor. But when he thought she was not looking, he showed the note to Garrett, and the two brothers exchanged a glance that carried the weight of everything they were not saying. That night, Clara could not sleep. She came downstairs for water and heard voices from behind the closed door of the study. Wyatt and Garrett speaking in the harsh whispers of men who were trying not to shout. She froze in the hallway. She knew she should go back to her room. She knew that eavesdropping was wrong, that the conversation was not meant for her, that the decent thing would be to fill her glass and retreat. But Thomas Caldwell's name reached her through the door, and Thomas Caldwell was the reason she was standing in this hallway, in this house, in this territory 3,000 miles from home. She pressed her back to the wall and listened. Garrett's voice ragged with the strain of something held too long. I cannot keep this to myself anymore, Wyatt. I have been telling Doc Wallace pieces of it late at night behind the boarding house because the weight of it was crushing me. But he says I need to tell you everything. I was there that night, at the Golden Spur. I saw what happened. Wyatt, controlled fury compressed into a whisper. Keep your voice down. Caldwell did not start that fight. It was Holloway, Crane's man. He goaded Thomas into it deliberately, pushed him, insulted him, would not let up until Thomas swung first. Then Holloway drew and shot him dead. Called it self-defense, but I am telling you, Wyatt, it was murder. Plain as the sun in the sky. Silence. The kind of silence that is not empty, but full, heavy with implications and consequences. Then Wyatt, can you prove it? My word against Holloway's, and Crane owns half the witnesses in that saloon. Garrett's voice dropped even lower. But Wyatt, Thomas told me something the week before he died. He said Crane wanted his land badly, not just for the grazing. He said he had proof the land was worth more than anyone knew, and he had hidden it where Crane could not find it. What kind of proof? He would not say, but he was scared, Wyatt. I have never seen Thomas Caldwell scared of anything in his life. And that last week he was scared. Clara's knees went weak. Wow. She braced one hand against the wall to keep herself upright, the water glass forgotten, her mind racing through every implication of what she had just heard. Thomas Caldwell, the man she had agreed to marry, the man whose letters she carried in her carpetbag. He had not been killed in a random dispute over water rights. He had been murdered, deliberately, by a man working for Victor Crane. And Garrett Hawthorne had watched it happen and carried the secret ever since, confiding only in the town doctor who had treated the body and knew the wound told a different story than the official account. She returned to her room on silent feet, set down the water glass with trembling hands, and sat on the edge of her bed in the darkness. She thought about the man in the black duster who had watched her at the station. She thought about Victor Crane's cold gray eyes. She thought about Mrs. Finch's casual observation. Third rancher this year. She thought about the note on the gate, mind your own cattle, and she thought about what she was going to do with what she knew. The next morning, everything had changed, even though nothing on the surface showed it. Garrett cracked jokes about burned toast. Silas quietly refilled everyone's coffee. Wyatt sat at the head of the table studying a cattle report with the concentrated focus he brought to everything. Clara set down her fork and spoke into the ordinary silence of a ranch morning. I have decided to stay. All 3 brothers looked up. What, just for the month? For as long as you will have me. This ranch needs managing. The children at the neighboring farms need teaching. and I have discovered that I rather like Colorado." The relief was immediate and distinct in each face. Garrett grinned broadly. Silas gave a small, satisfied nod, and Wyatt held her gaze for a long moment. Something warm and something dangerous kindling in those amber eyes, a fire behind the granite that he did not try to hide and could not quite control. "Then welcome to Hawks Ridge, Miss Whitmore. Properly." That night in her room, Clara opened her carpet bag and removed the bundle of Thomas Caldwell's letters. She untied the blue ribbon and spread them on the bed. She reread his warning about men who would take what was not theirs. She reread his mention of precautions taken. She thought about the murdered rancher and the hidden proof and the land speculator and the hired gun and the charming brother with the guilty secret. Clara Whitmore had come to Colorado to be a bride. She had stayed to build a home. And now, without fully understanding the danger she was stepping into, she had committed herself to a mystery that could get them all killed. She extinguished the lamp and lay in the darkness, listening to the vast Colorado silence outside her window, and felt the strange, terrible, exhilarating weight of his life that had changed direction for the second time in 6 months. She had arrived a day too late for Thomas Caldwell, but as the night settled over Hawks Ridge and the mountains stood watch against the stars, Clara Whitmore began to suspect that she had arrived exactly on time for something else entirely. 6 weeks changed everything and nothing. The land remained indifferent. The mountains did not care that Clara Whitmore had scrubbed every floor in the Hawthorne ranch house until the wood grains shone like honey in the morning light. The wind that swept down from the peaks carried no opinion about the fact that the kitchen garden had been reclaimed from a wilderness of weeds and now held neat rows of late-season vegetables, pushing green and determined through the Colorado soil. The creek that watered the south pasture flowed with the same unhurried patience it had maintained for 10,000 years, ignorant of the woman who had reorganized every shelf and every drawer and every account ledger in the main house, and somehow in the process reorganized the men who lived there. But if the land did not notice, old Emmett Dawson certainly did. Emmett had worked for the Hawthorns since Wyatt was a boy, with too much responsibility and not enough years to carry it. He had watched 3 brothers grow from grief-stricken boys into capable men. He had buried their father, comforted their mother, and taught all 3 of them things their old man had been too harsh or too distracted to teach: how to read weather from the shape of clouds, how to mend a fence that would hold through a blizzard, how to sit a horse in a way that said you belonged in the saddle and not on it. Emmett Dawson was 58 years old, tough as rawhide and loyal as bedrock, and he had seen enough of life to know when something important was happening. Something important was happening at Hawks Ridge. He noticed it the way he noticed changes in the herd. Not in any single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small shifts that added up to a transformation. The house gleamed. Windows that had been opaque with months of grime now caught the morning sun and scattered light across clean floors. The porch, which had been slowly surrendering to neglect, now had swept boards and a repaired rocking chair with a cushion on the seat. The smell that greeted Emmett when he came to the main house for his weekly supply meeting with Wyatt was no longer the stale odor of 3 men failing at domesticity, but the warm, complex fragrance of bread baking and coffee brewing and something with cinnamon that made his mouth water before he reached the door. But it was the brothers themselves who showed the most dramatic change. Wyatt still left early and returned late, but he no longer ate standing at the kitchen counter like a man fueling a machine. He sat at the table. He waited for Clara to serve. He said grace when she asked him to. And he lingered after supper in a way Emmett had never seen, finding reasons to remain in the warm kitchen while Clara cleaned and hummed melodies from a world 3,000 miles away. Garrett had cut his drinking in half. Emmett was not certain Clara had ever said a word about it. Her mere presence seemed to have recalibrated the middle brother's habits, as if the simple fact of a decent woman under the same roof made the bottle less necessary as a companion. And Silas, quiet, watchful Silas, who had not sung since their mother's funeral, had started singing while he worked. Emmett heard it from across the yard one morning and stopped in his tracks and stood there listening with the dumb, grateful expression of a man hearing church bells after a long absence. "That girl has done more for this family in 6 weeks than I managed in 13 years, Emmett told his son Nolan over supper in the bunkhouse. There was no jealousy in the observation. Only the profound relief of an old man watching something broken begin to mend. Clara had established routines that gave the ranch house a heartbeat it had lacked since the brother's mother died. Breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, opera at 7, Account review every Monday. Supply list prepared every Wednesday for the Saturday trip to town. The rhythms were simple, but their effect was profound. A house with routines is a house with purpose, and purpose was the thing that had been missing from Hawks Ridge for 8 months. But Clara's role had expanded beyond the domestic. She had begun to teach. It started with 2 children from the Henley Ranch brought by their mother Ruth after she heard that the new woman at Hawks Ridge was a former schoolteacher from Philadelphia. Within 2 weeks, there were 4 students. Within a month, 8. Within 6 weeks, 12 children from 4 different ranch families rode in on ponies each morning, their faces scrubbed and their slates tucked under their arms to sit in a room that had been a storage closet and was now something close to a miracle. Silas had done it. Without being asked, without announcement, without any of the fuss that Garrett would have made, or the deliberation that Wyatt would have required, the youngest Hawthorne brother simply spent 4 days converting the storage room into a classroom. He built small desks scaled to children's heights, each one sanded smooth enough that no splinter could find a small finger. He constructed benches with backs because children who leaned against something sat longer and listened better. He mounted a proper blackboard on the wall framed in cherry wood and crafted a set of alphabet blocks from scrap timber, each letter carved with the precise attention of a man who believed that the details mattered even when no one was watching. The morning he showed it to Clara, she stood in the doorway with her hand pressed to her mouth and tears running freely down her cheeks. Silas stood behind her, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his ears flushing red in the way of a young man confronted with a woman's tears and possessing absolutely no protocol for dealing with them. "Thank you," Clara whispered. "You have no idea what this means to me." Silas nodded. "Everyone deserves to learn," he said quietly, and that was all he said, and it was exactly enough. This scene, witnessed by accident from the hallway, produced a complicated expression on Wyatt Hawthorne's face. Warmth for his brother's generosity fought with something tighter and less comfortable, something that tightened his jaw and narrowed his eyes and made him turn away before either of them could see it. Wyatt Hawthorne was not a man who admitted to jealousy. He would have denied it with genuine conviction. But the sight of Clara's tears and Silas's quiet gift and the easy warmth between them stirred something in his chest that he did not want to name and could not entirely suppress. The courtship between Clara and Wyatt did not begin with a declaration or a decision. It began with Sunday rides. Wyatt started taking Clara out on horseback each week and always to the same destination. A high ridge that overlooked the entire ranch, a place where you could see Hawks Ridge spread out below like a painting, and the mountains standing guard on the horizon, and the sky stretching overhead in an unbroken dome of blue that made everything below it seem both small and infinitely precious. These rides became their private territory, away from the house, away from the watchful eyes of Garrett and Silas and old Emmett, away from the children in the account books and the 1,000 daily negotiations of shared domestic life. Wyatt was different. The granite softened. The careful control relaxed by fractions. He spoke more freely, and what he spoke about revealed a man of far greater depth than his stoic exterior suggested. He told Clara about his father, a hard man, not cruel exactly, but constructed from materials that did not include tenderness. The beatings were never savage, but they were consistent, administered with the same businesslike efficiency with which the elder Hawthorne branded cattle or mended fence. Praise was so rare that Wyatt could remember every instance. 3 times. In 19 years. He told her about taking over the ranch at 19, the day after they buried his father in frozen ground during the worst blizzard anyone in the territory could remember. About the terror that ate at him those first years, the certainty that he would fail, that the ranch would go under, that his brothers and his mother and his sister would pay the price for his inadequacy. About the drought years when he ate nothing but beans and hard bread for months so that Garrett and Silas and Maggie could have proper meals, and how he told them he simply was not hungry, and how they believed him because they were young and because they needed to believe that their eldest brother had everything under control. And then on a Sunday ride in early September, with the aspen trees just beginning to turn gold at their edges, Wyatt told Clara about Ellen. "I was engaged once," he said, and his voice carried the careful flatness of a man handling something fragile that he had not taken out of storage in a long time. 5 years ago, her name was Ellen Prescott. She taught school in Silverton before Miss Perry. She was pretty smart kind, the sort of woman who could walk into a room full of strangers and make every one of them feel like they mattered. He paused. The horses walked on. The wind moved through the grass. Pneumonia took her in January. She was 24 years old. I sat with her for 3 days and watched her fight and watched her lose, and there was not a single thing I could do about it. Not one thing. Clara felt the weight of this confession settle between them. Not just the loss itself, enormous as it was, but the 5 years Wyatt had spent building walls against the possibility of ever feeling that helpless again. 5 years of granite, 5 years of control, 5 years of refusing to let anyone close enough to matter, because the last person who mattered had died in his arms while he held her hand and prayed to a God who apparently had other plans. "I am sorry," Clara said simply. She must have been a remarkable woman. She was. Wyatt looked at Clara then, and there was nothing guarded in his gaze. It was open and direct and carrying something that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. "But I have started to believe that the heart has room for more than one remarkable woman in a lifetime." The words hung between them in the golden September air. Clara did not respond with speech. The moment was too fragile, too important for ordinary language to bear its weight. Instead, she reached across the space between their horses and laid her hand on his forearm. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, and she felt the muscles tense at her touch, a reflex born of years of holding everything tight before they deliberately, consciously relaxed. Neither spoke again until they reached the ranch. Both understood that something fundamental had shifted between them, invisible but irreversible, changing the shape of everything that would follow. The thunderstorm arrived on a Tuesday evening in the third week of September, rolling across the prairie like an advancing army, the sky turning from blue to iron to black in the span of an hour. Lightning fractured the darkness in branching rivers of white fire, and the thunder that followed shook the windows in their frames and made the horses stamp and whinny in the barn. Clara and Wyatt sat on the covered porch, coffee in hand, watching the spectacle with the shared silence of two people who had grown comfortable enough to be quiet together. The air was heavy with ozone and electricity, and something else, something that had been building between them for weeks, accumulating charge like the clouds overhead, waiting for the moment of discharge. "In Philadelphia," Clara said, "storms just meant wet feet and ruined hats. Here they feel almost alive." "Everything feels more alive out here," Wyatt agreed, and his eyes met hers for a moment before he looked away. Clara gathered her courage. "Wyatt," she said, using his first name for the first time, and the sound of it changed the air between them as surely as the lightning changed the sky. He turned to face her, and she saw something kindle behind his amber eyes at the intimacy of his own name spoken in her voice. "I have been meaning to thank you properly," she continued. "What you did for me offering this position when I had nowhere to go. It was the act of a good man." His expression softened. "You have more than earned your keep, Clara." Her name on his lips for the first time, and the warmth that flooded through her at the sound of it was so intense she felt it in her fingertips. "The house has not been this well managed since Mother was in her prime. The books make sense for the first time in years, and the teaching." He struggled with something, some thought or feeling that was fighting to get past the granite. "My mother would have loved you." The rain began, heavy and warm, drumming on the porch roof, turning the world beyond the railing into a curtain of silver. Neither moved to go inside. The storm provided cover, a wall of noise and water that enclosed the porch in its own private sphere and made honesty feel not only possible but necessary. "I have been thinking," Wyatt said, and his voice was almost drowned by a rumble of thunder. "Winter is coming in a few months. The passes get difficult. Town is hard to reach." He paused. He took a breath. "Clara, would you consider staying on permanently?" Her heart quickened. "As your housekeeper?" "No." He set his coffee down and turned to face her fully, and the look in his eyes was the most vulnerable thing Clara had ever seen on a face that strong. "I know this is not what you came west for. You expected to be a wife, not an employee. But these past weeks, getting to know you, seeing your strength, your kindness, the way you have made this house a home again." He reached for her hand, slowly giving her every opportunity to pull away. She did not pull away. "I find myself hoping for something more than an arrangement." "What exactly are you proposing, Wyatt Hawthorne?" "Courtship. Proper courtship." His smile was warm despite the rain hammering around them. I am not asking you to marry me today. We should take time, be sure. But I want you to know my intentions are honorable and my feelings are genuine. You came here, a stranger, Clara, and somehow you have become the person I most want to see at the end of every day. Clara felt a weight she had been carrying since the day she arrived in Colorado lift from her shoulders and dissolve into the rain-soaked air. The uncertainty, the fear, the constant calculation of whether she was safe, whether she was wanted, whether this fragile new life would hold her weight or collapse beneath her. I would like that very much, she said. The sky opened completely, rain pouring in sheets, and they ran inside laughing, soaked to the skin and light, with the giddy relief of two people who have finally said the thing that needed saying. In the hallway, they stood dripping, breathing hard, close enough that Clara could feel the heat radiating from his body through his wet shirt, and the air between them was charged with something that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Garrett emerged from the study, took one look at their flushed and rain-drenched faces, and grinned with the satisfied expression of a man who had been waiting for exactly this. Well, he said, it is about time. But the story of Hawks Ridge was not only a love story. Running beneath the tender surface of Clara and Wyatt's growing bond, like an underground river beneath a flowering meadow, the darker current of Thomas Caldwell's murder continued to flow. Clara had not been idle since overhearing Garrett's confession. She had been investigating with the quiet, systematic persistence of a woman trained to organize information and draw conclusions. She gathered intelligence the way she gathered eggs from the henhouse carefully and every morning. Mrs. Doris Finch at the boarding house proved to be an inexhaustible source of local knowledge, her knitting needles clicking out gossip with the steady rhythm of a telegraph machine. From Mrs. Finch, Clara learned the names of the other ranchers who had suffered misfortune after crossing Victor Crane. Hank Morrison, whose barn burned the same month he refused Crane's purchase offer. Will Brewster, thrown from a horse that had been gentle its entire life, the same week he told Crane's men to leave his property. Both men had sold their land to Crane at reduced prices afterward, broken in spirit if not in body. Miss Perry, the departing schoolteacher, mentioned over tea that she had seen Crane's lawyer visiting the territorial land office more often than any honest business would require. Dr. Josiah Wallace, who had treated Thomas Caldwell's body, confided to Clara something that had troubled him since the night of the killing. The bullet wound was close range from and on, but Thomas's gun was still in its holster when they brought him in. A man does not draw a weapon on someone who has already drawn on him and then forget to actually draw. The wound said murder. The holstered gun said ambush, disguised as a fair fight. Clara recognized the doctor's careful bearing and measured voice as belonging to the man she had seen speaking with Garrett in the alley that night at the boarding house, and the connection made sense. Wallace had been treating the body and the conscience of two different men, one dead and one alive, both burdened by the same truth. Clara brought everything she knew to Wyatt and Garrett, and the conversation that followed around the kitchen table with Maggie present as well, having ridden out for a weekend visit, was the moment the story expanded from personal loss to communal danger. They laid out the facts like cards in a grim poker game. Victor Crane had been systematically acquiring land in the valley around Silverton. Willing sellers received fair prices. Unwilling sellers experienced escalating pressure. Lowball offers, then threats, then accidents. Thomas Caldwell had been the most stubborn holdout, and Thomas Caldwell was dead. Now his property, which shared a water source with Hawks Ridge, was tied up in debt and available for purchase. If Crane acquired Caldwell's land, he controlled the water rights for the entire Eastern Valley, which meant he held a blade at the throat of every remaining rancher, the Hawthorns included. But Thomas had told Garrett, in the weeks before his death, that his land held something more valuable than cattle grass. He said he had proof, but would not elaborate. Clara asked a question that silenced the room. Thomas sent me his personal effects before I left Philadelphia. A small trunk with papers, his family Bible, and some odds and ends. It is still at Maggie's boarding house. She looked around the table. Has anyone thought to look through it carefully? Nobody had. The following Saturday, Clara and Maggie went through Thomas Caldwell's trunk with the meticulous attention Clara brought to everything she touched. Most of the contents were ordinary. Deeds, tax receipts, a faded photograph of his parents standing before a sod house on the Kansas prairie, squinting against the sun, their faces set with the determination of people who had chosen difficulty over despair. A worn leather wallet containing $3 and a pressed wildflower. But the trunk had a false bottom. The compartment was so cleverly constructed that only someone looking carefully, someone trained to notice things that did not quite add up, would find it. Clara found it because one side of the trunk felt lighter than the other when she tipped it, and because she was the daughter of a man who had taught her that the truth often hides in the spaces people overlook. Inside the hidden compartment, rolled tight and sealed with wax, were two documents. The first was a geological survey commissioned by Thomas and conducted by a mining engineer 6 months before his death. The survey identified significant silver deposits on Caldwell's land, concentrated in the Rocky Hills on the northern section of the property. The mineral rights alone, the engineer estimated, could yield returns that dwarfed the value of the land for cattle ranching by a factor of 50. The second document showed that Thomas had filed a mining claim with the Territorial Registry in Denver. But the filing had been marked as received and then inexplicably classified as misfiled. Lost in the system. Vanished. Clara stared at the papers in her hands, and the picture that had been assembling itself in fragments since the day she arrived in Silverton finally came into focus, sharp and complete and terrible. Thomas Caldwell was not killed over water rights. He was killed for silver. Victor Crane knew about the deposits and he wanted them, and the only thing standing between Crane and a fortune in mineral wealth was one stubborn rancher who refused to sell. So Crane had him killed. And then he arranged for the mining claim to disappear so that when he acquired the property through the bank's debt settlement, the silver would come with it unencumbered and unclaimed. This is why Thomas died, Clara said, and her voice was steady even though her hands were not. And this is why Crane will come for anyone who threatens his plan. She brought the survey documents to Wyatt, and the scene that followed was one of the most emotionally complex moments in the story so far. Wyatt read the papers twice slowly, and then he set them down on the desk and stood and walked to the window and stared out at his land for a long time without speaking. When he turned back, his face held anger and grief and fear and calculation all at once, layers of emotions stacked like geological strata in the face of a cliff. "If we take this to the sheriff, Crane will know we have it," Wyatt said. "He will come for us. If we do not take it to the sheriff, Crane gets away with murder," Clara countered. "And eventually he comes for your land too, Wyatt. He controls the water once he has Caldwell's property. You know that." Garrett spoke from the doorway. "There is a third option. We buy Caldwell's property ourselves. The bank is looking for a buyer to settle his debts. If we own the land, we control both the water rights and the silver claim. Crane cannot touch us. We cannot afford it," Wyatt said flatly. "The debt on that property is beyond anything we could carry." And then Silas spoke. He had been sitting in the corner listening with the patient attention that was his hallmark, and now all eyes turned to the youngest brother as he produced a small notebook from his shirt pocket. It was filled with careful calculations and neat, precise handwriting. "What if we pooled our savings, all three of us, plus what we would get from selling the South herd early? I have been running the numbers." He laid the notebook open on the desk, and the figures told a story of their own. Aggressive but not reckless. Ambitious but grounded in the real arithmetic of cattle prices and bank interest rates and seasonal revenue projections. Silas, the quiet one, the one his brothers sometimes mistook for the dreamer, had been analyzing the family's financial position with the rigor of a Philadelphia accountant. "It is tight," Silas said. "We would have to sell the South herd before winter, which means taking a lower price. We would need every dollar of saved wages from all three of us. And we would need a bank in Denver that is not under Crane's influence to carry the note." He closed the notebook. "But it is possible." Wyatt stared at his youngest brother with an expression that began as surprise and ended as something very close to awe. "You have been planning this." "I have been preparing for the possibility," Silas corrected quietly, "in case someone needed to have the numbers ready." The decision to pursue the land purchase unified the household around a shared mission, but it also painted a target on their backs. 2 weeks after Clara's discovery of the survey, Garrett rode to Denver to meet with cattle buyers for the early herd sale. He was expected back on a Tuesday. Tuesday came and went. By Wednesday morning, Wyatt was pacing the porch with the controlled energy of a man containing an explosion. By Wednesday afternoon, he and Silas saddled up and rode the trail toward Denver. They found Garrett 3 miles from the ranch, lying in a dry creek bed with his horse grazing nearby and his saddlebags torn open, their contents scattered across the rocks like the aftermath of a small, vicious storm. He had been beaten badly. 3 cracked ribs, his face swollen and discolored, one eye completely shut beneath a purple mass of bruised tissue. His left arm hung at an angle that no arm was designed to achieve, the bone broken cleanly between elbow and wrist. His lips were split. His shirt was torn and stained with blood that had dried to the color of rust. But Garrett was conscious, and the first words that came through his split and swollen mouth were not about his injuries. "They wanted to know about the survey," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "They know we have it, Wyatt." They brought him home on a makeshift litter fashioned from saplings and a blanket moving as quickly as the rough terrain would allow, while trying not to jar the broken arm that Garrett held against his chest with his good hand, his face gray with pain. He was too stubborn or too proud to voice. Clara set the arm. She had learned basic bone setting during the scarlet fever epidemic, when the overwhelmed charity hospital had pressed every able-bodied volunteer into service, and the knowledge came back to her now with the clarity that crisis provides. Silas held Garrett still, his craftsman's hands gentle but immovable. Wyatt gripped his brother's good hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. His jaw locked, his eyes bright with a fury and a fear he could not afford to show. Garrett, through the haze of agony, managed to crack a joke. "You should see the other fellows," he said through gritted teeth. "Actually, there were 4 of them, so maybe not." Nobody laughed, but the fact that he could still try was the thing that kept them from breaking. Dr. Josiah Wallace rode out from Silverton the next day and confirmed Clara's work. Broken arm, 3 cracked ribs, extensive bruising. 6 weeks minimum before Garrett could work. As the doctor prepared to leave, he pulled Wyatt aside. "This was not random, Wyatt. Someone sent those men. Your brother was targeted." "I know. Are you going to do anything about it?" Wyatt's jaw worked. "I am going to do everything about it." 2 weeks later, the church in Silverton was full for the first time since Easter. Reverend Isaiah Cooper had called a community gathering to discuss what he delicately termed matters of concern in the valley. The meeting had been quietly organized by Clara and Maggie, who had spent those 2 weeks visiting every ranch wife and shopkeeper's wife in the territory, sharing their concerns with the careful selectivity of women who understood that information was a weapon and should be deployed strategically. The church was packed. Ranchers in their Sunday clothes, uncomfortable in starched collars. Miners with dirt still under their fingernails. Shopkeepers, their wives, their older children. The entire human population of Silverton and the surrounding valley gathered in wooden pews beneath a simple cross, united by a growing unease that no one had been willing to name until now. Victor Crane was present. He sat in the front pew with the proprietary ease of a man who believed all rooms belonged to him. His lawyer Aldrich flanked him on one side, sharp-faced and taking notes. Jeb Holloway sat on the other, his flat predatory eyes scanning the crowd with the professional assessment of a man cataloging potential threats. Crane's expression was one of amused condescension, the look of someone attending a performance he expected to find beneath him. Sheriff Harlan Beckett moderated with visible discomfort, his badge freshly polished, as if he were trying to convince himself of his own authority. Several ranchers spoke. Jack Henley described the escalating pressure to sell his property. A widow named Mrs. Patterson told how her late husband's ranch had been the target of mysterious fence cuttings and missing cattle in the months before he agreed to sell to Crane at half its value. Each account was individually dismissible. Coincidence, bad luck, the hazards of frontier life. But together they formed a pattern that even the most determined skeptic could not ignore. Then Clara stood. She was small, she was blonde, she was soft-spoken. She was wearing a blue dress that was slightly too large because she had been working harder than she had been eating, and she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had buried her parents, crossed a continent, and arrived to find her future husband dead and had not yet been broken by any of it. Crane likely dismissed her on sight. A mail-order bride playing at frontier life. A girl from the East with opinions above her station. That was his mistake. Clara did not speak about the silver survey. That card she held close, waiting for the moment when it would do the most damage. Instead, she spoke about Thomas Caldwell. She spoke about the man she had never met but had come to know through his letters, a man who wrote about his land with the love most people reserve for family. She spoke about his plans for the future, the fruit trees he wanted to plant, the house he wanted to build. And then she named names. Thomas Caldwell, she said, her voice steady and clear in the silent church, shot dead in the Golden Spur Saloon 3 months ago. Hank Morrison, whose barn burned the same month he refused a purchase offer from Mr. Crane. Will Brewster, thrown from a horse that had been gentle its entire life, the same week he told Mr. Crane's men to leave his property. She paused, let the names settle into the silence like stones dropped into still water. I am new to this valley. I am a woman from the East, and I know some of you think I do not understand how things work out here. But I understand mathematics. I understand patterns. And I understand that when good men keep dying or getting hurt after crossing the same person, that is not coincidence. That is design. The church was silent. Even the babies had stopped fussing as if the very air held its breath. I am not asking you to take up arms. I am asking you to open your eyes. I am asking you to remember that this valley belongs to the families who work its land, not to speculators who profit from fear. And I am asking publicly on the record with God and as my witness for a proper investigation into the death of Thomas Caldwell. She sat down. Wyatt, seated beside her, took her trembling hand beneath the pew and held it. His grip was strong and warm and absolutely steady, and it said everything his face did not show. Crane rose. He was smooth. He was polished. He expressed deep sympathy for the emotional young woman who had lost her intended husband and was clearly overwrought by grief. He denied any wrongdoing with the practiced fluency of a man who rehearsed his innocence the way actors rehearse their lines. His lawyer nodded along, making notes with the mechanical precision of a man billing by the hour. But the mask slipped, just for a moment. When Clara had named the 3 victims, something flickered behind Crane's gray eyes that was not surprise but recognition, the involuntary acknowledgement of a man hearing his own crimes cataloged in public. And when Clara asked for an investigation, Holloway's hand drifted toward his hip in a reflex that every rancher in the room recognized for what it was. The seed was planted. As families filed out into the evening, the response was divided but encouraging. Jack Henley gripped Wyatt's hand and said simply, "Whatever you need." Tom Sutter, the blacksmith, offered to keep watch on Crane's movements. Mrs. Finch, the perpetual knitter, patted Clara's cheek and whispered, "Brave girl, your Thomas would have been proud." On the ride home, Garrett was unusually quiet. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of its usual lightness. "That was the bravest thing I have ever seen anyone do, Clara, including anything my brothers or I have ever done with a rope or a rifle." "I was not brave," Clara said. "I was angry. There is a difference." "Not to the people in that room," Silas said from behind them. "To them it looked exactly like courage." 1 week after the town meeting, Crane delivered his answer. Clara woke in the deep darkness of a moonless night to the smell of smoke. Not the wood smoke of a fireplace or cook stove, familiar and benign, but the acrid chemical tang of kerosene and burning hay, the smell of something that was not meant to burn, being forced to burn by human hands. She leaped from bed and ran to the window and saw the barn ablaze. Flames climbed the walls in sheets of orange and gold, licking upward from the base where someone had piled hay and soaked it with fuel. The fire had found the dry timber and was consuming it with the hungry efficiency of something alive. And above the roar and crackle, Clara could hear the horses screaming inside, the sound of absolute animal terror that cut through the night like a blade. She screamed for the brothers. She heard boots hitting the floor overhead, the crash of doors, the thunder of men descending stairs. Wyatt erupted from the house, first pulling on boots, his face set in the fierce mask of a man whose worst fear was materializing in front of him. Silas was a step behind, already calculating, already assessing. And then Clara saw the second fire. The bunkhouse was burning too. A smaller blaze set at the far corner, designed to divide their response and maximize the chaos. Old Emmett and Nolan were inside. Clara ran, barefoot, in her nightgown, her hair loose and wild. She ran across the yard to the bunkhouse and pounded on the door and screamed their names, and she kept screaming until she heard Emmett's voice shouting back, and the door burst open and the old man and his son staggered out, coughing and cursing, their eyes streaming from the smoke. Wyatt and Silas had charged into the barn to release the horses. Silas went for the ground stalls, throwing open doors, driving panicked animals toward the wide entrance with slaps and shouts. Wyatt went up to the loft. Because Garrett was in the loft. He had been sleeping in the barn for the past week, claiming his bed was uncomfortable, but actually stationing himself as a first line of defense, a watchman sleeping among the animals because he felt guilty for not having spoken up sooner about what he saw at the Golden Spur, and because he believed correctly that if Crane struck, he would strike at the barn. Garrett had put himself between danger and his family, and now danger had arrived with kerosene and matches. Wyatt found his brother in the loft, dazed by smoke, disoriented, his healing arm cradled against his chest. He grabbed Garrett by the shirt and hauled him to his feet, and then because the stairs were already burning and there was no other way down, he threw his brother over his shoulder and carried him. The image burned itself into Clara's memory with the permanence of a brand. Wyatt Hawthorne emerging from the burning barn with his brother draped across his massive shoulders, silhouetted against walls of flame, his face a mask of agony and determination, his arms and hands blistering from the heat, refusing to stop, refusing to fall, refusing to let go of the person he was carrying. It was the most extraordinary thing Clara had ever witnessed, and in that moment, watching this man walk through fire for his family, whatever remained of the wall between gratitude and love inside her crumbled to ash. They lost the barn roof. They saved the structure. They saved every horse, including Belle, who emerged wild-eyed and trembling, but unharmed. They saved Emmett and Nolan. Nobody died. But the message was delivered with the precision of a rattlesnake's strike. Bend or burn. Dawn found them on the porch, faces blackened with soot, clothes reeking of smoke. Wyatt's burned hands wrapped in bandages, Clara had applied with trembling fingers and steady skill. The sun rose over Hawk's Ridge, painting the damaged barn in shades of gold and crimson, and somewhere in the south pasture, a calf bawled for its mother, a sound so ordinary and alive that it cut through the despair like a blade of grass through ash. The brothers sat in a silence that could have tipped either way, toward surrender or toward defiance. The weight of what had happened pressed down on all of them. Clara broke the silence. "Thomas Caldwell died because he would not give in to this man," she said, and her voice carried the clarity of a bell struck in cold air. "If we sell, if we run, his death means nothing. Hank Morrison's barn, Will Brewster's accident, all of it meaningless. And every family in this valley will know that Victor Crane can take whatever he wants from whoever he wants, and one will stop him." She looked at Wyatt. "You told me once that you built this ranch from nothing, that you ate beans for months so your brothers could eat. You did not build Hawk's Ridge to abandon it." She held his gaze. "And I did not cross 3,000 miles to run away from a bully." Wyatt stared at her. This small, fierce, soot-streaked woman who had arrived in his life as a stranger and become its center, who organized his books and fed his family and taught the valley's children, and now stood on his porch with ash in her hair and fire in her eyes and told him exactly who they were going to be. "No," he said quietly. "We do not run." "We do not run," Garrett echoed from his chair, his voice rough from smoke and resolve. "We do not run," Silas confirmed, and the youngest brother's quiet conviction carried the weight of bedrock. The fire had consequences beyond resolve. Wyatt's burns needed tending, and in the evenings that followed, Clara became the one who cleaned and wrapped his hands, working with gentle precision under the lamplight, while the rest of the household settled into the quiet rhythms of nightfall. It was during one of these sessions, 4 nights after the fire, that the last wall between them fell. Clara was finishing the bandage on his right hand when Wyatt caught her fingers gently in his. His touch was careful, conscious of the raw skin on his palms, but it was deliberate in a way that no accidental contact could be. "You are trembling," he said softly. "I was terrified," Clara admitted. "When I saw the fire, when you went into that barn, I thought I was going to lose you before I ever truly had you. I am not easy to lose. Do not joke, not about this." Her eyes were bright with tears she refused to let fall. "I came here expecting to marry a stranger, and I found something I never expected. A family, a purpose. And you, Wyatt Hawthorne, somehow impossibly you." Wyatt lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her fingers. It was the first physical expression of his love, gentle and reverent, and it carried more weight than any grand gesture could have because it came from a man who did not do anything without meaning every atom of it. "I love you, Clara Whitmore," he said. I think I have loved you since you stood in my kitchen, covered in flour, and told me my bookkeeping was atrocious. Clara laughed through her tears. I believe I said it needed improvement. Same thing. That night, after the lamps were extinguished and the house settled into silence, Wyatt came to her door. He stood in the doorway, and the question in his eyes needed no words. Clara took his hand and drew him inside, and the door closed softly behind them. When morning came, everything between them had changed in the most fundamental way, and neither of them would ever sleep alone again. In the days that followed, neighboring ranchers, galvanized by the fire, organized a watch rotation for the valley's properties. The barn was being rebuilt with lumber and labor from 4 different families. The cattle sale was proceeding according to Silas's financial plan, and Wyatt had approached a Denver bank not controlled by Crane's interests about financing the purchase of Caldwell's property. The valley was standing up, slowly and perfectly, with the uncertain courage of people who had been afraid for a long time and were only now discovering that fear was not the same thing as helplessness. But Victor Crane was not defeated. He was cornered and cornered. Men are the most dangerous of all. On a Friday evening, 2 weeks after the fire, Sheriff Harlan Beckett rode out to Hawks Ridge with news that drove the color from Wyatt's face. A judge in Denver, a man known to be friendly with Crane's interests, had signed an order accelerating the sale of Caldwell's property. The bank was being pressured to accept Crane's offer. The Hawthorns had 2 weeks to secure their financing, or they would lose their chance to buy the land, and with it, their best weapon against the man who was trying to destroy them. 2 weeks, 14 days, the difference between victory and ruin compressed into a fortnight. That same night, after the household had gone to bed, and the lamps were extinguished, and the only light was the thin silver of a crescent moon through the window, Clara stood alone in her bedroom with one hand resting on her stomach. The nausea had started 3 days ago. She had attributed it to the lingering smell of smoke that seemed to permeate everything: the walls, the curtains, her hair, the very air of the house. But the smoke was nearly gone now, and the nausea remained. It came in the morning and faded by noon, and returned at night with a reliability that was impossible to ignore. Clara Whitmore knew what it meant. She was a woman of education and observation, and she knew. She stood at the window looking out at the moonlit silhouette of Hawks Ridge, the mountains standing guard on the horizon, the damaged barn rising against the stars like a wounded soldier who refused to lie down, and she pressed her palm flat against her belly and whispered into the darkness, "Not now, please, not now." But the body does not negotiate with timing, and the heart does not wait for convenient moments. And the life growing inside Clara Whitmore was as indifferent to her schedule as the Colorado landscape was to her plans. Everything was about to change again. She told Maggie first. They were in the back room of the boarding house on a Saturday morning, ostensibly sorting fabric for new curtains, though Clara had not touched a single bolt of cloth since they sat down. Her hands were in her lap, still and purposeful, and she watched Maggie with the focused attention of a woman about to change the terms of every conversation that would follow. "I need to see Dr. Wallace," Clara said, "and I need you to come with me." Maggie set down her scissors. She looked at Clara's face, then at Clara's hands resting in her lap, then at Clara's face again, and something shifted in her expression. The sharp, practical intelligence that made Maggie Hawthorne Wells the most capable woman in Silverton assembled the evidence in an instant. "How late?" Maggie asked simply. 6 weeks. Maggie was quiet for 3 full seconds, which for a woman of her temperament was the equivalent of a long and thoughtful silence. Then she crossed the room and took Clara's hands in both of hers. "Well," she said, "let us go see the doctor." Doctor. Josiah Wallace was a lean, deliberate man with kind eyes behind wire spectacles and hands that moved with the unhurried precision of someone who understood that patience was often the best medicine. He confirmed what Clara already knew with a gentle nod and a warmth in his voice that made the clinical fact feel like a blessing rather than a complication. "You are in excellent health, Miss Whitmore," he corrected himself, and the slight stumble over her title carried the weight of a social reality that Clara was already calculating. She was unmarried, she was pregnant, it was 1875, and the man she loved was in the middle of a fight for his family's land and livelihood against an enemy who had already proven willing to burn and beat to get what he wanted. Walking back to the boarding house through the autumn streets of Silverton, Clara made a decision that revealed more about her character than any speech or confrontation ever could. She would not tell Wyatt, Not yet. Not because she was ashamed and not because she doubted his response. She knew Wyatt Hawthorne well enough by now to know exactly what he would do. He would propose immediately. He would marry her before the week was out. He would wrap his protective instincts around her like a fortress wall and redirect every ounce of his energy from the land fight to her safety. And that was precisely the problem. With Crane's accelerated sale bearing down on them, with the financing still unsettled, with the stakes higher than they had ever been, Clara refused to become the reason Wyatt took his eyes off the battle that would determine their future and the future of every family in the valley. She wanted him to choose her freely. Not out of obligation, not because circumstance demanded it. She wanted to hear him ask her to be his wife because she was the woman he loved, not because she was the woman carrying his child. "He will want to marry you immediately, you know," Maggie said, reading her thoughts with the unsettling accuracy of a woman who had known the Hawthorne men their entire lives. "I know, and I want to marry him, but not because of this, not under pressure. I want him to choose me for me." Maggie studied her for a long moment. "Clara Whitmore, that man has been choosing you since the day he found you at the train station. The baby just gives him a deadline." Clara also told Silas. She found him in the workshop behind the barn, which had survived the fire intact. He was sanding a piece of furniture, the rhythmic whisper of sandpaper on wood filling the small space with a sound like breathing. Sawdust dusted his forearms and caught the light from the window in tiny golden motes. He looked up when Clara entered, and his green-amber eyes held the patient attentiveness of a man who understood that people came to him when they needed to say something important, and that the most useful thing he could do was be still and listen. She told him plainly. Silas set down his sandpaper. He was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful in the way that other men's expressions were surprised, as if the information was not unexpected, but required careful consideration nonetheless. Then he took her hand, pressed it briefly, and said, "This family needed a new beginning. You are giving us one." He picked up the sandpaper and resumed working. It was the most perfectly Silas response Clara could have imagined, and she loved him for it. Not the way she loved Wyatt, with fire and need and a hunger that sometimes frightened her with its intensity. She loved Silas the way she might have loved a brother, with a warm and steady certainty that required no examination and carried no complications. He was the person in the family who saw things most clearly, and what he saw he accepted with a grace that his older brothers were still learning. The 2 weeks that followed were the most pressured of Clara's life. Wyatt and Garrett traveled to Denver to finalize the financing with Theodore Marsh, the banker who had his own reasons for wanting to see Crane's expansion checked. The negotiations were complicated by Crane's lawyer Aldridge, who filed motions and raised objections with the mechanical persistence of a man paid handsomely to obstruct. But Marsh was a formidable ally, and his own lawyer proved equally persistent, and by the end of the second day the loan was secured. Backed by the combined value of the Hawthorne Ranch and the projected earnings from the cattle sale Silas had meticulously planned, the financing was sufficient to match any bid Crane could make. But the court-ordered sale was now just days away, and Crane was applying pressure from every direction. His men harassed ranchers who had pledged support to the Hawthornes, cutting fences and driving small herds off grazing land in acts of petty intimidation that could not be traced to any individual, but carried Crane's signature as clearly as a brand on cattle. Jeb Holloway was seen in Silverton with increasing frequency, his presence a constant reminder that the man behind the money was willing to use force when money failed. Clara held the household together through force of will. She maintained the routine she had established. Breakfast at 6, classes for the children in the morning, account reviews, supply lists. She cooked and cleaned and taught and organized, and if she sometimes paused in the middle of a task with her hand pressed against her stomach and her eyes distant, nobody noticed except Silas, who noticed everything and said nothing. She also continued her investigation. Letters sent to the Territorial Mining Registry confirmed that Thomas Caldwell's claim filing had been received by a clerk who subsequently departed the territory. Further correspondence with postmasters in 3 towns traced the clerk's movements and established that he had been paid through an intermediary connected to Crane's Denver operation. The paper trail was not enough for a criminal conviction, but it was enough to establish a documented pattern of corruption that a territorial judge would find compelling. 3 days before the land sale, Clara made a discovery that changed everything. She was going through Thomas Caldwell's Bible. The leather-bound volume had been in his trunk of effects, and Clara had taken it out weeks ago with the vague intention of finding a suitable passage for the wedding ceremony she hoped was coming. The Bible was old and well-used, its pages soft from years of handling, its margins annotated in Thomas's careful handwriting with observations and reflections that revealed a more thoughtful man than his plain-spoken letters had suggested. She was turning the pages of the book of Ruth, thinking about the story of a woman who traveled to a strange land and found her home there when a sealed envelope fell from between the pages and landed in her lap. It was addressed in Thomas Caldwell's handwriting to Mrs. Thomas Caldwell. The letter inside was dated the day before his death. Clara's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was firm, but hurried, the pen pressed hard into the page, the words of a man who knew he was running out of time. "Dear Clara," the letter began, "for that is how I have come to think of you, though we have never met. If you are reading this, it means I was right to be afraid, and I am likely no longer alive to greet you as I had hoped. I write this not to frighten you, but to ensure that the truth survives, even if I do not. A man named Victor Crane has been threatening me for months. He wants my land not for the cattle or the water, but for what lies beneath it. Silver, enough to make a man very rich. I have proof of this in a geological survey I commissioned, which I have hidden in the false bottom of my trunk, the one I am sending to you with my other effects. I have also filed a mining claim with the Territorial Registry, but I fear Crane's men have intercepted it. If something happens to me, take the survey to the Territorial Marshal in Denver, not the local sheriff who I no longer trust to act against Crane's interests. The marshal's office is on Larimer Street. Ask for Marshal Braddock. He is a fair man and beyond Crane's reach. But I write this letter for another reason. I want you to know that I chose you from among many respondents to my advertisement, not because of your age or your appearance, which I could only imagine, but because of your letters. You wrote with intelligence, with courage, and with an honesty I have rarely encountered in any person, man or woman. In your words, I found a spirit that matched the land I love, strong enough to endure its hardships and generous enough to appreciate its beauty. I believe you would have been a fine wife and a better woman than I deserved. I regret that I will not have the chance to prove myself worthy of you. If I am dead when you arrive, do not grieve for me. I was a man of the land, and the land endures. Find someone worthy of you, Clara. Build the life you deserve. And if you can see that justice is done for those of us who were not strong enough to fight Crane alone. With respect, and yes, with the affection, I wish I had been brave enough to express sooner, Thomas Caldwell." Clara read the letter twice. The first time through tears that blurred the words into illegibility and forced her to blink and wipe her eyes and start again. The second time with a clarity that was almost painful, each sentence landing with the force of a truth that had been buried and was now finally unearthed. She wept for Thomas Caldwell, not the abstract grief she had felt upon arriving in Silverton and learning of his death, the grief of a plan disrupted and a future erased. This was personal. This was the grief of reading a good man's final words and knowing that he had written them, thinking of her, that in the last hours of his life, he had sat down and poured his heart onto paper for a woman he would never meet, because he wanted her to know that she mattered, that his choice of her had been deliberate, and considered that she was not merely a name in a matrimonial newspaper, but a person whose words had reached him across 3,000 miles, and made him believe that something decent and true might still be possible in a world that was closing in around him. She dried her tears. She folded the letter with the care one gives to sacred things, and she carried it into the study where Wyatt was hunched over land documents, working through the evening by lamplight, and said the words that set the final act in motion. "I have something you need to see, and then we need to send for the Territorial Marshal." The letter was the key that opened every locked door. Combined with the geological survey, Garrett's eyewitness testimony about the Golden Spur confrontation, Dr. Wallace's observations about the wound and the holstered gun, and Clara's documented paper trail connecting the missing mining claim to Crane's associates, it constituted a case that no honest lawman could ignore. Wyatt read the letter in silence. When he finished, he set it down on the desk and was quiet for a long time. When he looked up, his amber eyes were bright with an emotion that was equal parts grief and gratitude, and a fierce protective love directed not at the dead man, but at the living woman who had carried his truth 3,000 miles and delivered it here to this desk in this room at exactly the right moment. Thomas Caldwell was a better man than any of us knew, Wyatt said quietly. He deserves justice, Clara replied, and we are going to get it for him. A rider was dispatched to Denver that night with a letter from Marshal Braddock's office. The fastest horse in the valley, ridden by Nolan Dawson, who was young enough to ride through the night and strong enough to make the journey in a day and a half if he changed horses at the relay station in Morrison. Whether the response would arrive in time for the land sale was impossible to know. They could only act on what they could control and trust the rest to the providence that had brought Clara Whitmore to Silverton one day late and exactly on time. The proposal came 2 days before the sale on a golden October afternoon. Wyatt took Clara to their ridge. The aspens had turned fully, now the mountainsides painted in strokes of gold and amber that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in shimmering waves. The ranch spread below them like a kingdom in miniature smoke, curling from the kitchen chimney, where Silas was attempting Clara's stew recipe, with results that would later prove optimistic. The rebuilt barn stood beside the original new timber, bright against weathered wood. The schoolhouse with its red door was visible near the main house, a small beacon of color in the vast landscape. Wyatt was nervous. Clara could tell because he kept adjusting his hat, a gesture she had learned to read weeks ago. It was the only break in his composure that he could not control a small human crack in the granite that she found endearing beyond measure. He helped her down from Belle and they stood facing each other with the mountains behind them and the whole of their world at their feet. Clara, he said, and the way he said her name, with a roughness that was not about his voice, but about what the word cost him to speak, told her everything that was coming. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you answer, nothing between us changes. You will always have a home here. That is not conditional on anything. That is a very reassuring preamble to a question you have not asked yet. The ghost of a smile crossed his face. I have been practicing this for 3 days, and it was better in the barn. You practiced on the horses. Belle was supportive. The gelding seemed skeptical. Clara laughed, and the sound of it, bright and unguarded in the mountain air, seemed to give him the courage he needed. I want to build something with you, Wyatt said. Not just a ranch, though I want that too. A life, a family. I want to be the man who wakes up beside you every morning and falls asleep grateful every night. I want our children to grow up on this land and know they are loved. He took her hands. His palms were rough with healing burn scars from the night of the fire, and Clara felt every ridge and callus the map of a life lived in service to land and family, and an idea of duty that most men only talked about, and Wyatt Hawthorne simply did. Clara Whitmore, will you marry me? Not because you came west to be a bride, not because it is practical, not because the world says you should, but because I love you, because you are the finest and bravest person I have ever known. Because this ranch was a house before you came, and now it is a home, and I cannot imagine spending a single day of my future without you in it. Clara's tears fell freely. She let them. I love you, Wyatt, more than I knew was possible for one person to love another. She took a breath. And I need to tell you something before I say yes. She told him about the baby. She watched his face transform. The granite did not crack. It dissolved. What emerged beneath it was something Clara had never seen on Wyatt Hawthorne's features, a wonder so complete and so unguarded that it made him look 10 years younger, as if the weight of everything he carried had been lifted in a single moment by a truth he had not anticipated. A child, he whispered. Our child. I wanted you to ask me for me, Clara said. Not for the baby. That is why I waited to tell you. Wyatt pulled her into his arms. The first full embrace of their story, and Clara felt his heart beat against her cheek, strong and rapid, the heart of a man who had spent 5 years behind walls and now stood in the open with nothing between himself and joy but the woman he held. Clara, he said, and his voice was thick with emotion, you magnificent, impossible woman. You thought I needed a reason beyond you. He tilted her chin up, his thumb gentle on her jaw. I would have asked you that first night on the porch in the thunderstorm if I had not been afraid you would think I was moving too fast. And under the gold and scarlet canopy of Colorado autumn, with the mountains as witnesses and the wind carrying the scent of the first distant snow, Wyatt kissed Clara. The kiss was gentle and sure and unhurried, the kiss of a man who had waited a long time and intended to take none of it for granted, and Clara understood at last what the word home truly meant. Not a place, not four walls and a roof, but this man, this moment, this certainty. They were married 2 days later in the small church in Silverton, and the ceremony was both a celebration and an act of defiance. Reverend Isaiah Cooper officiated with genuine warmth, his weathered face creased in a smile that suggested he found the workings of providence both mysterious and deeply satisfying. "The Lord moves in ways we cannot predict," he said. "Sometimes the delay of a train is the greatest blessing he can bestow." Maggie stood as Clara's witness, crying happy tears that she dabbed with a handkerchief embroidered with her late husband's initials, the past and the present and the future, all woven together in a square of white linen. Garrett, his arm finally free of the sling, stood for Wyatt and delivered a toast that had the entire church laughing through their tears. "My brother is the stubbornest man in Colorado territory," Garrett said, raising his glass. 14 years I have watched him run this ranch with a jaw set like a bear trap and a heart he kept locked in a box and buried in the yard. It figures that the only woman who could match him would arrive in a dust storm with a carpetbag and an attitude. To Clara, who taught us all that a home is not a building, but a feeling. And to Wyatt, who finally figured out that a man does not have to carry the world alone. Silas's wedding gift was the thing that broke Clara completely. He brought it out after the ceremony wrapped in a wool blanket, and when Clara folded back the fabric, she found a cradle. Cherry wood hand-carved, sanded to a finish so smooth it felt like silk beneath her fingers. Along the headboard, Silas had carved a pair of hawks in flight wings, spread soaring above a mountain ridge, and between them in letters so fine they might have been printed the words, "Built with our own hands." Clara looked at the cradle and then at Silas, and then she could not see anything at all, because the tears were too thick and too fast. Wyatt put his arm around her, and his own eyes were suspiciously bright, and Garrett cleared his throat several times in rapid succession, and old Emmett Dawson blew his nose into a bandana with a sound like a small trumpet. The town turned out in force, not just for the free food and the excuse for celebration, though both were welcome in a frontier community where entertainment was scarce. They came because Clara's arrival and the events that followed had become Silverton's story. The mail-order bride who came for one man and found another. The woman who stood up in a church full of strangers and named the villain that everyone had been afraid to name. The family that refused to run when their barn burned. The wedding reception became an impromptu council of war ranchers gathering in quiet groups between bites of cake to discuss the land sale scheduled for the following morning. The mood was determined but anxious. Everyone knew what was at stake. Everyone knew that Victor Crane would be there with his Denver lawyer and his bottomless wallet and his hired gun standing behind him like a loaded weapon. The morning of the sale dawned cold and clear, the kind of crystalline autumn day that turned the Colorado sky into polished blue glass and made the mountains look close enough to touch. Clara dressed carefully, choosing the navy blue traveling dress she had worn the day she arrived in Silverton, the same dress that now bore the alterations Maggie had made to accommodate her changing figure. She pinned her mother's cameo at her throat, the same brooch she had worn when she stepped off the train into a dead man's town 3 months and a lifetime ago. Wyatt watched her from the doorway. "Whatever happens today," Clara said, meeting his eyes in the mirror, "we face it together." "Together," Wyatt confirmed, and the single word carried the weight of everything they had built. The sale was conducted on the steps of the Silverton courthouse by the bank manager Elias Partridge, a nervous man whose spectacles kept sliding down his nose and whose stammer grew more pronounced as the crowd grew larger. Sheriff Harlan Beckett stood to one side, his badge freshly polished, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver with the uncertain grip of a man who hoped desperately that he would not need to use it. The town had gathered. Every rancher in the valley, there was their older children, miners from the surrounding hills, every shopkeeper on the main street. They lined the boardwalks and filled the courthouse steps and stood in the street itself, a mass of frontier humanity united by the shared understanding that what happened in the next hour would determine the future of the place they called home. Victor Crane arrived in his black carriage drawn by matched gray horses, an ostentatious display of wealth, in a town where most men rode a single horse that they also used for work. His lawyer Aldridge sat beside him, sharp-faced and carrying a leather case. Jeb Holloway rode alongside, his black duster coat open despite the cold, his flat eyes scanning the crowd with the professional detachment of a man cataloging targets. Crane descended from the carriage with the polished ease of a man who believed the world arranged itself for his convenience. He surveyed the gathered crowd with a faint smile that did not touch his gray eyes, and took his position at the front of the courthouse steps with the proprietary confidence of someone who had already decided how this would end. His bid, delivered by Aldridge in a clipped and professional voice, was 30% above the assessed value of Caldwell's property, a sum calculated not merely to win, but to annihilate. A financial sledgehammer applied where a tap might have sufficed, designed to demonstrate that resistance to Victor Crane was not merely futile, but foolish. Then Wyatt stepped forward. He wore his best shirt and his cleanest hat, and the same steady expression he brought to everything, the look of a man who had stared down blizzards and droughts and the death of people he loved and had not yet been broken by any of it. His bandaged hands were steady, his voice was clear. The Hawthorne counter, bid backed by Theodore Marsh's Denver financing, matched Crane's offer dollar for dollar, and it included an additional provision that sent a ripple of approval through the assembled crowd. The buyer would honor all existing water-sharing agreements with neighboring ranches, preserving the communal system that had sustained the valley's families for a decade. Crane's smile tightened. Aldridge immediately challenged the bid, citing the residency motion filed the previous week. Partridge, the bank manager, wavered visibly, caught between the legal pressure from Denver and the moral pressure of 200 pairs of eyes that knew exactly what was at stake. The crowd's murmur shifted from approval to anger. Jack Henley's voice rang out from the back. "Since when do Denver lawyers tell us who can buy land in our own valley?" Shouts of agreement. The tension wound tighter. Partridge looked like a man who wished very much that he had chosen a different profession. And then from the far end of the main street came the sound of horses. Not one or two, 6 riders approaching at speed, their hoofbeats rolling down the packed dirt street like the opening notes of thunder. The crowd parted, heads turned. Crane's expression shifted for the first time, a flicker of something that was not concern, but was its close neighbor. The lead rider wore a silver star on his chest that caught the morning sun and threw it back in a flash of authority. Behind him rode 4 deputy marshals and a man in a dark suit who carried himself with the quiet gravity of someone who represented something larger than himself. Marshal Braddock, Territorial Marshal's Office, Denver. The man Thomas Caldwell had named in his final letter as the one person in the territory beyond Victor Crane's reach. Braddock dismounted with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. He was not tall, not physically imposing, not the kind of man you would notice in a crowd, but when he walked up the courthouse steps and produced a folded document from his coat, every person present understood that the ground had shifted. "I have here a court order from the Territorial Judiciary," Braddock said, his voice pitched to carry without shouting. "The sale of the Caldwell property is hereby suspended pending a criminal investigation into the death of Thomas Caldwell and related matters of land fraud, mining, claim tampering, and conspiracy." He looked at Crane with the flat, dispassionate gaze of a man doing a job he took seriously. "Mr. Crane, Mr. Holloway, and 3 named associates are requested to accompany us to Denver for questioning." The word requested carried the same weight as required. Everyone knew it, including Crane. For a moment, the entire scene held its breath. The crowd, the marshals, the Hawthornes standing together on the courthouse steps, Wyatt with his arm around Clara Garrett beside them, Silas behind a wall of family that had been forged in fire and held together by a woman who had arrived with nothing but a carpet bag and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Then Holloway made his mistake. It was small, a shift of weight, a hand drifting toward the hip where his gun hung. The movement was reflexive, born of years of solving problems with violence, and it lasted perhaps 2 seconds before his conscious mind caught up with his instincts and told him that drawing on 6 federal marshals in front of 200 witnesses was not a problem that violence could solve. But those 2 seconds were enough. Sheriff Harlan Beckett, who had spent months paralyzed by fear, who had watched his town be terrorized by a man he lacked the courage to confront, who had pinned his badge to his chest each morning, knowing he was failing the people who trusted him to protect them, drew his revolver and leveled it at Jeb Holloway. "Don't," Beckett said. One word, spoken quietly, carrying the weight of a man who had finally found the bottom of his fear and discovered that beneath it was something harder and more enduring. Duty. The thing he had sworn to uphold and had been failing to uphold and would not fail to uphold now in this moment, with his town watching and his badge on his chest and the future of everything he was supposed to protect hanging in the balance. Holloway froze. The marshals closed in. Crane was escorted toward the marshal's wagon, his composure crumbling with each step, his protests growing shrill in a voice that no longer sounded polished or powerful but merely frightened. As he passed Clara standing on the courthouse steps with Wyatt's arm around her and her hand resting on the place where their child grew, Crane stopped. His gray eyes locked on hers, and the rage in them was the impotent rage of a man who had been beaten by someone he had dismissed as insignificant. "You," he said, "a mail-order bride. You ruined everything." Clara met his gaze with the calm steadiness of a woman who had buried her parents, crossed a continent, stood up in a church full of strangers, survived a fire, and carried a dead man's truth 3,000 miles to deliver it to justice. "Thomas Caldwell ruined your plan when he hid the truth where you could not find it," she said. "I just delivered the message." Crane was led away. Holloway followed in irons. The crowd erupted. Ranchers who had lived under Crane's shadow for years embraced and shouted and threw their hats in the air. Women wept. Children cheered without understanding why. Old Emmett Dawson grabbed Nolan in a bear hug that lifted the younger man off his feet. It was not a clean victory. The legal process would take months, and the outcome of the trial remained uncertain. But the tyrant had been dethroned, and the community that had been living in fear had discovered in the space of a single morning that they were stronger than the thing they had been afraid of. This trial took place in Denver 3 months later, and its outcome reached Silverton through Garrett, who had traveled to testify and returned with stories that he told and retold at Maggie's boarding house until every person in the valley had heard them. He described the moment Thomas Caldwell's letter was read aloud in the courtroom, how the jury foreman's face changed from skepticism to certainty, how Crane's composure, already frayed, collapsed entirely, the carefully maintained mask of civilized authority falling away to reveal the desperate predator beneath, how a woman in the gallery wept openly and was later identified as the widow of Hank Morrison, the rancher whose barn Crane's men had burned. Crane was convicted of conspiracy to commit fraud, intimidation, and accessory to murder. 15 years in the territorial prison. Holloway received 8 years for manslaughter. 2 associates received shorter sentences for their roles in the scheme. The verdicts resonated far beyond the valley. The territorial governor, embarrassed by the scope of corruption the trial revealed, appointed a commission to review land transactions across Colorado territory. Justice, it seemed, had a longer reach than Victor Crane had calculated. Winter arrived, and with it the intimate joys and quiet revelations of Clara and Wyatt's first season as husband and wife. The snow sealed the mountain passes and isolated the ranch, and the world contracted to the size of a well-kept house on a gentle rise, smoke rising from its chimney lamplight, warm in its windows, and inside 2 people discovering the daily miracle of a shared life. Wyatt was different in winter. With the external threats neutralized and the land secured, the granite relaxed into something warmer, something that had been hidden beneath years of vigilance and was only now emerging into the light. He laughed more easily. He lingered in the kitchen in the mornings, drinking coffee and watching Clara cook with an expression of quiet contentment that transformed his face. He read aloud in the evenings, his deep voice filling the room with Tennyson and Mark Twain, and the sound of it reminded Clara so powerfully of her father reading Dickens in the Philadelphia row house that she sometimes had to turn away to compose herself. Clara continued teaching through the winter. 12 students now, their ponies stamping in the cold outside the schoolhouse, while inside the stove that Silas kept loaded each morning before dawn radiated heat, and the children bent over their slates with the focused determination of young minds discovering the power of written words. The schoolhouse with its bright red door became a source of pride for the entire valley, a symbol of what was possible when people chose to build rather than tear down. The brothers found their individual paths. Wyatt's walls remained down. He would never be a man of many words, but the words he gave Clara carried a weight that volumes could not match. "Good morning. How are you feeling? I love you." 3 phrases spoken daily with a sincerity that made each repetition feel like the first time. He still rose before dawn and worked until the light failed, but he came home at noon now, always crossing the yard with the long stride of a man who had somewhere good to be. Garrett channeled his charm into civic purpose. His testimony at the trial had awakened something in him, a passion for the machinery of justice and governance that surprised everyone except Clara, who had always suspected that beneath the jokes and the easy grin lay a man of serious convictions. When Silverton held its first proper election for a town council, Garrett won by a margin that embarrassed his opponents and delighted his family. He also began courting Catherine Marsh, the spirited, red-headed niece of the Denver banker, who had come to Silverton to teach school after Miss Perry's departure. Garrett insisted the connection to the banker was pure coincidence. Nobody in the family believed him, and Catherine herself found the denial amusing enough to repeat at every opportunity. Silas's path was the quietest and perhaps the most beautiful. His friendship with Clara had given him permission to be fully himself, and the man who emerged was both the ranch hand his brothers needed and the artist his mother had always known he was. He began selling his carved furniture through a dealer in Denver, where it was praised for craftsmanship that balanced frontier strength with a delicacy of detail that seemed almost impossible from hands so large and calloused. The income supplemented the ranch earnings, and the recognition gave Silas a confidence that showed in the way he carried himself straighter, more certain a man who had found the place where his abilities and his purpose intersected. He also began corresponding with a woman in San Francisco, a bookshop owner who had written to compliment the inlay work on a writing desk Silas had sold through the Denver dealer. Their letters grew longer with each exchange. By late winter, Silas mentioned casually at the supper table that he might ride west in the spring to visit a business associate. Garrett's grin stretched so wide it threatened to meet at the back of his head. Maggie and Nolan Dawson found each other in the way that people sometimes do not, through dramatic revelation, but through the steady accumulation of small moments. Nolan, emboldened by the general atmosphere of courage and new beginnings that seemed to have settled over the valley like weather, finally asked Maggie to dinner. She accepted with the brisk practicality of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this question and was glad it had finally arrived. Old Emmett, upon hearing the news, celebrated by getting drunk for the first time in 7 years, and Wyatt had to drive him home in the wagon while the old man sang Camptown races in a voice that frightened the horses and delighted nobody. Spring came. The snow retreated up the mountains like a white tide going out, revealing the green and gold of new grass beneath. The creek swelled with meltwater. The calves were born wobbling on new legs, their mothers lowing with the ancient patience of creatures performing a task they understood at the deepest level of their being. The fruit trees Thomas Caldwell had dreamed of planting were finally planted, 20 saplings in neat rows on the south-facing slope of the combined property, and Wyatt told Clara they would not bear for 5 years, and Clara said she could wait, and the words meant more than fruit. Clara's time arrived on a morning in early July when the wild flowers had bloomed across the meadows, and the air was thick with the hum of bees and the particular sweetness of a world at the height of its growing season. Maggie and Dr. Wallace attended. Wyatt was banished to the porch, where he paced a groove into the floorboards that would remain visible for decades, a physical record of a man's love and terror and helplessness inscribed in wood. Garrett sat with him, attempting distraction through conversation that neither of them could concentrate on. Silas sat on the steps and whittled through an entire block of cherry wood, reducing it to a pile of fragrant shavings, his hands moving with the automatic precision of a man whose mind was somewhere else entirely. 14 hours. The longest 14 hours of Wyatt Hawthorne's life, longer than any blizzard he had endured, any drought he had survived, any night he had spent wondering if the ranch would make it through another season. He heard Clara cry out twice, and each time he started for the door, and each time Garrett caught his arm and held him, and the effort of not going to her was the hardest thing Wyatt Hawthorne had ever done. Dawn broke over Hawk's Ridge in shades of rose and gold, and with it came a sound that stopped Wyatt's pacing and Garrett's talking and Silas's whittling and the breathing of every person on that porch. The cry of a newborn, thin and furious and absolutely alive, splitting the morning air like a declaration of intent. Dr. Wallace opened the door. His face held the quiet satisfaction of a man who had just participated in the most fundamental of human miracles. "Congratulations, Mr. Hawthorne. You have a daughter." Wyatt entered the room and found Clara exhausted and radiant, her hair damp against the pillow, her eyes bright with a tiredness that went beyond the physical and into some deeper territory of the soul. In her arms, wrapped in the blanket Maggie had sewn, lay a small and perfect being with a thatch of dark hair, and when she opened her eyes for the first time, her father's amber gaze looking back at him from a face no bigger than his fist. "She is perfect," Wyatt breathed, and the tears that tracked down his weathered face fell without shame or resistance. The tears of a man who had spent years believing that the best of his life was behind him and now understood with a certainty that went beyond thought into the bedrock of his being that it was only beginning. They named her Ruth Ellen Hawthorne. Ruth for the book of the Bible, where Thomas Caldwell had hidden his final letter, the story of a woman who traveled to a strange land and found her home there. Ellen for the woman Wyatt had loved and lost, whose memory deserved to live on in the next generation. The name carried the weight of the past and the promise of the future in 4 syllables, and when Reverend Cooper baptized her in the Silverton Church on a Sunday morning in August, the entire valley turned out to welcome her. 25 years passed. The year was 1900, and the century had turned, and the world that Clara Whitmore had entered as a frightened girl with a carpet bag had transformed into something that Thomas Caldwell and his fruit trees and his lonely supper table could hardly have imagined. Wyatt Hawthorne was 58 years old. His chestnut hair had gone silver at the temples, and his knees protested on cold mornings, and he moved more slowly than the young man who had carried his brother out of a burning barn a quarter century ago. But his shoulders were still broad, his hands still strong, his amber eyes still sharp. And when he looked at Clara across the breakfast table each morning, the expression on his face had not changed since the night he told her he loved her on a rain-soaked porch in the autumn of 1875. Clara was 47. Her honey blonde hair had threads of silver woven through it now, and the lines around her eyes were deeper etched by years of sun and wind and laughter and the occasional tears that even the best lives cannot avoid. But her back was straight, her step quick, her cornflower blue eyes as sharp as ever, when a student gave a wrong answer or a ledger column did not balance. She still taught. The schoolhouse with its red door had expanded into a proper 2-room building, and over 25 years more than 200 children had passed through Clara's classroom and gone out into the world carrying the gifts she had given them. They were ranchers and teachers and nurses and a blacksmith and a lawyer in Denver and a newspaper editor in Cheyenne, and every one of them, when asked about the person who had made the greatest difference in their lives, said the same name. Ruth Ellen Hawthorne was 24 years old, married to the eldest son of Jack Henley, and the mother of a baby boy who had his grandfather's amber eyes and his grandmother's determined chin. The boy called Wyatt Grandpa Hawk and Clara Nana, and the sound of those names spoken in a child's voice could reduce Wyatt Hawthorne to a state of helpless tenderness that his younger self would have found incomprehensible. Thomas James Hawthorne. Their son, born 3 years after Ruth, stood nearly as tall as his father and worked beside him daily, learning the land, the way Wyatt had learned it through seasons and sweat and the slow accumulation of knowledge that could not be taught in any classroom, but could only be absorbed through the soles of one's boots. Garrett was 54, a territorial representative, now his charm deployed in the service of legislation rather than cattle sales. Catherine sat beside him at every public function, her red hair streaked with white, her wit as sharp as the day she arrived in Silverton, and told Garrett Hawthorne that she found his smile suspicious and his intentions obvious. They had 4 children, all of whom had inherited their father's gift for talking and their mother's gift for knowing when to stop. Silas was 51. He had traveled to San Francisco, met the bookshop owner, married her, and brought her back to the ranch, where she had established a small lending library in the schoolhouse that was now the most comprehensive collection of books in the county. His furniture was sold across the western states, and a rocking chair he had carved for the territorial governor's office was considered one of the finest pieces of frontier craftsmanship in existence. His auburn hair was gray at the temples now, but his hands still created beautiful things, and he still sang while he worked. Old Emmett Dawson had died in 1892 at the age of 75 and was buried on the hill overlooking the ranch in the spot he had chosen himself, with a view of the pastures and the mountains and the creek that never stopped flowing. His headstone, carved by Silas, read simply, "Loyal as bedrock." Hawks Ridge was one of the largest ranches in Colorado. The Silver Cooperative Choir that Clara had helped establish provided funding for schools and medical care throughout the valley. The road to Denver was now a day's journey instead of 3. There was a post office, a high school, and a small hospital, all built on foundations that traced their origins to a woman who arrived with $4 in a carpet bag in the belief that knowledge was the truest form of wealth. On a golden afternoon in October of 1900, 25 years, To the week since she had arrived in Silverton, Clara and Wyatt rode to their ridge. They moved more slowly now. Belle was long gone, replaced by a gentle mare named Penny, and Wyatt's gelding had given way to a steady, broad-backed horse that tolerated his rider's stiff joints with patient understanding. But the ridge was the same. The view was the same. The mountains stood where they had always stood, and the sky stretched overhead in the same endless dome of blue, and the wind carried the same scent of sage and distant snow. Below them, the ranch spread across the valley. The main house expanded twice with a new wing for the grandchildren and a library that would have impressed Clara's father. The barns painted red solid and square against the hillside. The schoolhouse with its red door smoke rising from the chimney as a young teacher trained by Clara prepared for tomorrow's lessons. Cattle grazing in pastures that stretched to the silver-bearing hills. And everywhere the evidence of lives being lived. Smoke from chimneys, children playing, horses in corrals, the sound of a hammer from Silas's workshop. Garrett's laugh carrying from somewhere near the main house, unmistakable even at this distance. "Did you ever imagine this?" Clara asked, leaning back against Wyatt's chest. The warmth of him was the same as it had always been, solid and certain and utterly reliable. "When you offered employment to a stranded mail-order bride at a dusty train station." Wyatt's arms tightened around her. His hands, scarred and weathered, still strong, rested over hers. "When I saw you that day," he said, "sitting on that bench with your carpet bag and your bundle of letters and your face so pale I thought you might faint. Something told me. I cannot explain what it was. I did not believe in that kind of thing. I still do not, mostly. But something looked at you and said, that is the one. Some might call it providence," Clara said softly. "I call it the best day of my life." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, the same gesture he had made 1,000 times over 25 years, never once diminished by repetition. "You arrived a day late for Thomas Caldwell, Clara Hawthorne, but you were exactly on time for us." Below them, the ranch went about its business. Ruth called the children in for supper. Thomas James led the horses into the barn. The last light of the October sun caught the red door of the schoolhouse and set it glowing like an ember against the gathering dusk. Somewhere in the house, a grandchild laughed, and the sound rose into the evening air and joined the wind and carried across the land that had endured before them and would endure long after, indifferent and eternal, holding within its vastness the small and precious lives of the people who had chosen to call it home. Clara closed her eyes and felt the truth of everything settle into her bones. The journey west had not led where she expected. The man she was meant to marry lay in a grave she tended with wildflowers every spring. The life she had planned, a quiet existence as a rancher's wife, had transformed into something immeasurably larger, a family, a community, a legacy, built from the wreckage of a plan that went wrong in exactly the right way. The train had been late. The groom had been dead. The future had seemed impossible. But Clara Whitmore, now Clara Hawthorne, had learned something in the wilds of Colorado Territory that all the books in Philadelphia could never have taught her. Sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a wrong turn, and the best destinations are the ones you never plan to reach. She had come west to survive. She had stayed to live. And in the golden light of that Colorado sunset, surrounded by the family she had found and the home she had built, 3 generations of Hawthorns on the land that held them, Clara knew with absolute certainty that every step of her journey, every terror, every fear, every moment of doubt, had led her exactly where she was meant to be. "You are home now, home."